Are you brave enough to venture into the darkest corners of the wilderness, where shadows dance and unseen eyes watch from the treeline? Tonight, we delve into the chilling reality of camping gone wrong. Forget peaceful nights under the stars, because these are 10 true disturbing camping in the deep woods bad decisions horror stories that will make you think twice before venturing off the grid. Prepare for tales of isolation, dread, and the terrifying unknown lurking just beyond the campfire light. Get ready to be disturbed. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you dare. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. Just me, myself, and the great outdoors. My name is Alex, and I've always been drawn to the wilderness. City life, with its constant noise and crowds, just wasn't for me. I needed the quiet, the solitude, the feeling of being small in the face of something vast and ancient. That's why I decided to take a solo camping trip to Blackwood Forest. I'd heard stories about it, of course whispers around campfires about strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and an unsettling feeling that lingered even after you left. But I'm not one for ghost stories. I'm a rational person, a scientist by trade. I believe in what I can see, touch, and measure. And what I wanted to measure was my own resilience, my ability to disconnect from the modern world and reconnect with nature. The drive to Blackwood was longer than I anticipated, winding through increasingly narrow roads, flanked by towering pines that seemed to block out the sun. By the time I reached the trailhead, dusk was already settling in, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that bled into an ominous gray. I hoisted my backpack, its weight of familiar comfort on my shoulders, and started my trek into the woods. The air was immediately cooler under the dense canopy, and the sounds of the road faded behind me, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. It was exactly what I was looking for. I followed the trail for about an hour, the fading light making the path ahead increasingly difficult to discern. I relied on my compass and the faint markings on the trees to guide me deeper into the forest. Finally, I reached a small clearing beside a creek, the perfect spot to set up camp for the night. The sound of the water was soothing, a constant murmur against the growing silence of the woods. I quickly got to work, unpacking my tent and assembling it with practiced ease. As I hammered in the last stake, darkness fully descended, swallowing the clearing in an inky blackness that felt almost solid. With my tent set up and my gear stowed inside, I started a small fire, the flickering flames pushing back the encroaching darkness and casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. Dinner was a simple, dehydrated meal, but it tasted like a feast after the day's journey. Sitting by the fire, sipping hot coffee, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This was it, the escape I craved. The forest was quiet, save for the crackling fire and the gentle flow of the creek. Perfect. As the fire began to die down, I decided to turn in for the night. I extinguished the embers, making sure no spark remained, and retreated into the tent. The nylon walls offered a thin barrier against the vastness of the woods, but it was enough to create a sense of enclosure of safety. I let out my sleeping bag, crawled inside, and zipped it up to my chin. The air inside the tent was cool and still, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. For a while, I just lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest. The creek gurgled nearby and the wind whispered through the trees, creating a soft rhythmic symphony. It was a lullaby, and I felt myself drifting towards sleep. But then I heard it, a rustling sound just outside the tent. It was faint at first, easily dismissed as the wind picking up, or perhaps a small animal foraging in the undergrowth. I told myself it was just a squirrel, or maybe a raccoon curious about the new arrival in their territory. Animals in the woods, that's all it was. Perfectly normal. I shifted in my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable, to ignore the sound and let sleep take over. But the rustling persisted, growing slightly louder closer. It wasn't the random, erratic movement of a small animal. This was different. It was a deliberate, rhythmic brushing against the tent fabric, circling my little nylon habit. My heart started to beat a little faster, a primal unease creeping into my peaceful solitude. Just animals. I repeated to myself, trying to sound convincing even in my own head. It's just the woods. But even as I said the words, a cold knot of dread began to tighten in my stomach, because then above the rustling, above the whisper of the wind and the murmur of the creek, I heard something else. Something that made my blood run cold. A whisper. My name. Barely audible. Carried on the night air, but undeniably there. Alex. It breathed just outside the thin wall of my tent. My breath hitched in my thorax. The whisper was soft, almost like a sigh, but there was no mistaking it. It was my name, spoken just outside my tent. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. It had to be the wind playing tricks with the leaves, forming sounds that resembled words. Or maybe it was just my imagination, the solitude and darkness getting to me. Yeah, that had to be it. Stress-induced auditory hallucination in the middle of nowhere. Perfectly normal. Except it didn't sound like the wind, and it didn't feel like my imagination. The whisper was distinct, clear, and undeniably directed at me. It was a voice, a human voice, but wrong. It lacked warmth, resonance, any sense of life. It was cold, flat, and carried an undercurrent of something else. Something unsettlingly ancient and devoid of emotion. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense, listening with every fiber of my being. The rustling continued, circling the tent, and the whisper came again, closer this time. Alex, are you there? The words were slightly clearer now, but the voice remained the same, chillingly flat and devoid of life. It was like a recording played back on old, damaged tape, distorted and hollow. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence that followed the whisper. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my attempts at rationalization. This wasn't animals. This wasn't the wind. This was something else. Something I couldn't explain, something that defied logic and reason. And it knew my name. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Clicking it on, I'd pointed the beam towards the tent wall where I'd heard the whisper. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the nylon fabric, but nothing else. No shadow, no movement, just the still dark woods beyond. Hello. I called out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound confident. Is anyone there? Silence. Only the gentle gurgle of the creek and the rustling of leaves answered me. For a moment, I thought maybe it was gone. Maybe it had been my imagination after all, a fleeting auditory anomaly born of fear and isolation. I started to breathe a little easier, the knot in my stomach loosening slightly. Perhaps I was just being paranoid. It was the woods, after all, known for playing tricks on your mind. But then the rustling started again, closer this time, right against the tent wall, and the whisper returned, right next to my ear, as if the speaker was pressed against the fabric. Alex, we know you're here. This time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a chorus of whispers, multiple voices, all flat, cold, and dead, speaking in unison. We've been waiting for you, Alex. Panic seized me, a suffocating wave that washed over my senses. My rational mind, my scientific training, all of it crumbled in the face of this impossible, terrifying reality. Something was outside my tent, something that knew my name, something that was whispering to me in a chorus of dead voices. And it was waiting for me. I scrambled to sit up in my sleeping bag, my heart hammering in my chest. My flashlight beam danced wildly around the tent as I frantically searched for my backpack, for anything that could be used as a weapon, for any means of defense against this unseen, whispering threat. My hands closed around the cold steel of my camping knife, its familiar weight offering a small measure of comfort in the overwhelming fear. Who's there? I yelled, my voice cracking with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. What do you want? I knew it was foolish to engage, to speak to whatever was out there, but I couldn't help myself. The silence was worse than the whispers, the unknown more terrifying than the chilling voices. The only response was the rustling, which intensified, becoming more frantic, agitated. It was no longer just brushing against the tent. It was scratching, scraping, as if claws were raking against the nylon, tearing at the thin barrier between me and whatever lurked in the darkness. And the whispers returned, louder now, surrounding the tent, coming from all directions. Alex and Alex, Alex, a cacophony of dead voices, a chorus of my name echoing through the woods. Each whisper colder and more menacing than the last. I pressed my back against the tent wall, my knife clutched tightly in my hand, my flashlight beam frantically sweeping across the fabric, trying to pierce the darkness to see what was out there. But there was nothing. Just the tent wall, the rustling, the scratching, and the whispers. They were everywhere, surrounding me, closing in. Alex, come out, Alex. They were inviting me, beckoning me in the darkness, into the unknown. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body trembling uncontrollably. I was trapped, cornered in my own tent, surrounded by something I couldn't see, couldn't understand, something that whispered my name with dead voices. The rational part of my brain, the scientist, was screaming at me to run, to escape, to get out of the tent and flee into the woods, even if it meant facing the darkness head on. But another part of me, a primal, instinctual part, was paralyzed by fear, telling me to stay put, to remain hidden, to hope that whatever was out there would eventually lose interest and go away. But I knew deep down that it wouldn't go away. It was waiting for me. It knew my name, and it was whispering, inviting me to join it in the darkness. Alex were waiting, Alex. The whispers were relentless, a constant, chilling reminder of the unseen presence that surrounded me. The first night in the woods, and it was already turning into a nightmare. A nightmare that was whispering my name. The whispers were incessant now, a maddening chorus that echoed inside my skull, even louder than the frantic pounding of my heart. Alex, waiting, come out, Alex. They were everywhere, surrounding the tent, pressing in, their dead voices weaving a suffocating web of dread. The scratching intensified, tearing at the tent fabric, and I flinched with each rasp, expecting the thin nylon to give way at any moment, to reveal whatever horrors lurked just beyond. My rational mind was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. Run. That was the only coherent thought left. I had to get out of the tent, out of this clearing, out of these woods. Survival instinct, raw and primal, finally overrode the paralyzing fear. I had to move. With trembling hands, I unzipped the tent flap, the sound of the zipper screeching in the oppressive silence like a death knell. I hesitated for a split second, my eyes squeezed shut, bracing for something, but nothing happened. The whispers continued, the scratching persisted, but the tent remained intact, the darkness outside still impenetrable. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I threw open the tent flap and scrambled out, my camping knife clutched tightly in my right hand, my flashlight beam cutting a shaky swath through the night. The clearing was empty, or at least it appeared to be. My flashlight illuminated the trees, the creek, the dying embers of my fire, but nothing else. No figures, no shadows, just the still, silent woods. Hello. I shouted again, my voice echoing weakly in the darkness. Show yourselves! What do you want? Foolish, reckless bravado, born of desperation and fear. I knew it was pointless. But I couldn't stand the unseen terror any longer. I needed to see something, anything, to fight back against the formless dread that was consuming me. The only response was the whispers, which seemed to intensify with my outburst, swirling around me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Alex, foolish, you cannot hide, we are the woods. Alex. The chorus of dead voices mocked me, their words laced with an ancient, chilling amusement. The forest knows your name. Alex, the forest knows you are here. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly, trying to pinpoint the source of the whispers, to find something, anything to focus on. But there was nothing to see. The trees stood silent and still, their branches reaching like skeletal arms against the starless sky. The creek gurgled on, oblivious to the terror that gripped me. The forest was a void, a black canvas upon which my fear painted its own monstrous images. Panic threatened to overwhelm me completely, to send me spiraling into mindless terror. I fought it back, clinging to the last vestiges of my rationality, forcing myself to think, to plan, to act. Running blindly into the woods was suicide. I needed a direction, a goal, a way out. The trail. I had to find the trail, the path that had led me into this nightmare. It was my only hope. Turning my back on the unseen horrors that whispered my name, I stumbled towards the direction I thought the trail lay, my flashlight beam bouncing erratically ahead of me. The undergrowth was thick, grabbing at my legs, slowing me down. Thorns tore at my clothes, scratching my skin. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every rustle of leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. Every whisper of the wind carried my name in dead voices. Alex, going somewhere, Alex. The forest is your home now, Alex. The whispers followed me, dogging my steps, mocking my desperate flight. They were everywhere, in the trees, in the shadows, in the very air I breathed. The forest itself seemed to be whispering to me, to be alive and malevolent, aware of my fear, feeding on it. I pushed through the undergrowth, stumbling, falling, scrambling back to my feet, driven by a desperate need to escape, to get away from the whispers, from the darkness, from the forest itself. I didn't know how long I ran, how far I went. Time lost all meaning, replaced by the relentless pursuit of the unseen, whispering presence. Then, through the trees, I saw it. A faint glimmer of light, a pale, ethereal glow that pierced the oppressive darkness. Hope surged through me, a fragile spark in the overwhelming fear. Light, it had to be the trail. Or something else. I didn't care. Light was light, and in this suffocating darkness, it was a beacon, a promise of escape. I stumbled towards it, pushing through the last vestiges of the undergrowth, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body screaming in protest. As I drew closer, the light grew stronger, resolving into a soft, warm glow that emanated from a clearing. A different clearing, larger than the one I had camped in, bathed in an unnatural, almost luminous light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. And in the center of the clearing, I saw them. Figures. Tall, slender shapes. Vaguely human in outline, but wrong. They were pale, almost translucent, their forms shimmering in the ethereal light, their features indistinct, blurred as if they were made of mist and shadow, and they were whispering. A chorus of dead voices, all speaking in unison, all saying my name. Alex, welcome home. Alex, you are one of us now. Alex. They turned towards me as I entered the clearing, their indistinct forms shifting, coalescing, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. They reached out towards me, their pale, elongated hands beckoning me closer. Join us, Alex, become one with the forest forever, Alex. Terror, pure and absolute, froze me in place. This was it. This was what the whispers had been leading me to. This clearing, these figures, this transformation. They weren't animals. They weren't the wind. They were something else entirely. Something ancient, something malevolent, something that had been waiting in these woods for who knew how long. And now, they were waiting for me. But even as fear threatened to consume me, a spark of defiance ignited within me. I wouldn't become one of them. I wouldn't surrender to the whispers, to the darkness, to the forest. I was Alexed, and I was not going to die here. Not tonight. With a roar that tore from my throat, I charged forward, not towards the figures, but past them, towards the opposite side of the clearing, towards the darkness beyond. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan, didn't even know if escape was possible. But I had to try, I had to fight. The whispers erupted into a deafening cacophony, a chorus of rage and frustration. Alex, no! You cannot escape. The forest claims all, Alex. The figures shimmered, moved, but I didn't look back. I ran blindly, desperately, crashing through the undergrowth, ignoring the thorns, the branches, the darkness, driven only by the primal need to survive. I ran until my lungs burned, my legs ached, my body screamed for rest. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Not while the whispers echoed in my ears. Not while the image of those pale, shimmering figures burned in my mind. I ran until the unnatural light of the clearing faded behind me, until the whispers grew fainter, until the forest around me seemed normal again. Or as normal as a dark, silent forest could be at night. Finally, I collapsed, gasping for breath. Leaning against a tree, my body trembling, my mind reeling. The whispers were gone, or at least, I couldn't hear them anymore. The forest was silent again, save for the familiar sounds of the night, the wind, the creek, the rustling leaves. It was still dark, still terrifying, but different. The oppressive, malevolent presence was gone, or dormant. I sat there for a long time, catching my breath, trying to make sense of what had happened, of what I had seen, of what I had heard. Rational explanations remained elusive. Science offered no answers for whispering forests and pale, shimmering figures. Maybe it had been a hallucination, a product of stress and exhaustion. Maybe, but deep down I knew it was real. Something real, something terrifying, something ancient and malevolent that dwelled in Blackwood Forest. As dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky in streaks of gray and pink, I finally stood up, my body stiff and sore, my mind still reeling. I didn't go back for my tent for my gear. I just walked, followed the faint trail, retracing my steps from the day before, until I finally emerged from the trees, blinking in the pale morning light, the road stretching ahead of me, a path back to civilization, back to safety. I never went back to Blackwood Forest, and I never camped alone in the woods again. The memory of the whispers, of the pale figures in the clearing, of the chilling dread that had consumed me that night, remained, a permanent scar on my mind. Sometimes in the quiet of the night, I still hear them. Faint whispers carried on the wind, saying my name. Alex the forest remembers Alex, and I know, with a cold certainty that chills me to the bone, that Blackwood Forest is still waiting, and it still knows my name. They say the forest remembers. I never really bought into that kind of folksy wisdom, not until recently anyway. Now, with the chill of the evening seeping into my bones even here by the fire, I'm starting to think maybe the old-timers were onto something. Maybe places do hold on to things, echoes of what happened there, whispers in the wind that only some of us are unlucky enough to hear. My name's Jake. Just Jake. No fancy last name or anything. I'm what you call an outdoorsy type, I guess. Grew up in the suburbs, sure, but my dad, bless his adventurous soul, dragged us out into the wilderness every chance he got. Camping trips were our family vacations. National parks were our playgrounds. He instilled in me this itch, this need to get lost in the green, to breathe the air that hasn't been recycled a million times through city vents. That's probably why I talked Sarah into this hike. Sarah's she was my girlfriend. Things are a bit complicated now, to say the least. We needed a break, a reset button in our lives, which had somehow morphed into this tangled mess of bills. Arguments about whose turn it was to do the dishes, and a general feeling that we were both just going through the motions. My brilliant idea, in my infinite wisdom, was a weekend in the Blackwood Forest. Blackwood. Even the name sounds ominous, doesn't it? It's not a national park or anything. More like a large patch of state-owned land that's been left to its own devices. Locals whisper stories about it, naturally. Every small town has its haunted woods, its cursed crossroads, its abandoned asylum. Blackwood's claim to fame was just weirdness. People went in, sometimes they didn't come out, or if they did, they came back different. Lust hikers mostly, or so the official report said. But the whispers painted a different picture. Something about the woods changing people, twisting them inside out. I scoffed at it all, of course. Urban legends, campfire tales to scare teenagers. I'm a rational guy. I believe in science and logic, in the things you can see and touch and measure. But even I had to admit, thumbing through the online forums dedicated to Blackwood, that there was a persistent unease surrounding the place. Pictures people posted were unsettling. Twisted trees, shadows that seemed too dark, a general sense of wrongness that seeped out of the digital images and prickled at your skin. Still, I was determined. We needed this. Sarah, bless her skeptical heart, was less enthusiastic. Jake, are you sure about this? Everyone online says it's creepy. Like, really creepy. Exactly. I'd replied, maybe a little too enthusiastically. That's the point. We need to get away from the normal, the predictable. A little creepy might be good for us. Famous last words, right? The drive was long, wending through increasingly narrow roads that tunneled through dense foliage. The air grew cooler, damper, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy overhead. Even before we parked the car at the trailhead, there was a shift in atmosphere. The usual sounds of the world traffic hum, distant sirens, the chatter of people faded away, replaced by nothing much. Just the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig under our boots. Normal forest sounds, but muted. Distant, like the world was turning down the volume. The trailhead itself was barely marked, just a small wooden sign nailed to a tree, half obscured by moss. Blackwood State Forest, Trailhead 3. No cheerful park ranger station, no helpful maps, no other cars in the small, overgrown parking area. Just us, the woods, and an unnerving silence that already felt heavier than it should. We started hiking, the path narrow and overgrown in places. The trees were tall, ancient, their bark thick and gnarled, like the skin of some slumbering beast. Sunlight filtered down in fractured beams, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. It was beautiful, in a way, wild, untamed, untouched by the hand of man. But there was an edge to it, a sense of watchfulness, like the woods were aware of us, observing our intrusion with silent, ancient eyes. We hiked for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the green labyrinth. The trail climbed steadily uphill, winding through stands of pine and oak, past most covered rocks and fallen logs. The air grew stiller, the silence more profound. Even the usual forest noises, birdsong, the buzz of insects, the scampering of small animals began to fade. It was like walking into a soundproof room, a place where the world outside simply ceased to exist. It's quiet, Sarah said finally, her voice a little too loud in the stillness. She stopped, tilting her head, listening. Too quiet, don't you think? I shrugged, trying to sound nonchalant. It's a forest, Sarah. Sometimes it's quiet. No, not just quiet. It's a dead quiet, like everything's holding its breath. I listened then, really listened, and a prickle of unease started to crawl up my spine. She was right. It wasn't just the absence of human noise. It was the absence of all noise. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, no squirrels chattering. Just the whisper of the wind through the leaves and the soft crunch of our boots on the forest floor. And silence. A thick, suffocating blanket of silence that pressed in on you, making your ears ring. We kept walking, the silence growing heavier with each step. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out more and more of the sky. Shadows deepened, stretching long and distorted across the path. The air grew colder still, a damp, clammy chill that seeped into your clothes and clung to your skin. Then we found it, the clearing. It was like stepping out of a dark tunnel into emptiness. The trees abruptly parted, opening into a wide, circular space bathed in an unnatural, almost ethereal light. The canopy thinned here, letting in a flood of pale sunlight that illuminated the clearing with an almost theatrical intensity. It should have been beautiful. A perfect, secluded spot, ringed by ancient trees, carpeted with soft moss and ferns. The kind of place you'd see in a movie, where woodland creatures would gather and fairies would dance in the moonlight. But it wasn't beautiful. It was wrong. The silence here was amplified, magnified. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. Like all sound had been sucked out of the air, leaving behind a vacuum that pressed against your eardrums. And the light, that strange pale light, it didn't feel warm, didn't feel welcoming. It felt cold. Artificial. Like stage lighting in some macabre play. We stood at the edge of the clearing, Sarah and I just staring. Neither was nothing to say. The silence had swallowed our words, choked them in our throats. I scanned the clearing, trying to find something, anything, to break the spell. A bird, an insect, a rustle in the undergrowth. Anything to prove that this was still a forest, still a part of the natural world. But there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. No movement, no sound, no sign of life at all. Just the moss, the ferns, the trees, and that oppressive, all-consuming silence. It was like the clearing was sterile, empty. A void carved out of the heart of the woods. Jacob, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I could see the fear in her eyes reflected in the unnatural light of the clearing. Jake, I don't like this place. And for the first time, I had to admit it. Neither did I. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me, telling me it was just a clearing, just a quiet spot in the woods. But something deeper, something primal, was whispering a different story. A story of something ancient, something wrong, something waiting. Too much silence. That's what it was. Too much silence in a place that should have been teeming with life. And in that silence, I could hear something else. Something faint, something distant, but undeniably there. A whisper, just at the edge of hearing. A whisper that seemed to come from the clearing itself, from the very ground beneath our feet. A whisper that said, "We're here. We're here." The whisper wasn't in my ears, not exactly. It was inside my head, a thought that wasn't my own, a voice that resonated somewhere deep within my skull. It was faint, almost subliminal, but undeniably there, a cold tendril of sound snaking its way into my consciousness. I blinked, looking around the clearing again, trying to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just my imagination, the silence playing tricks on my mind. Stress, exhaustion, the general weirdness of the place, any of those could explain it. Rational explanations. That's what I needed to focus on. Rationality. Did you hear that? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide, darting around the clearing, searching for something, or perhaps someone. Hear what? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, to project an air of calm I definitely wasn't feeling. That voice, she said, her brow furrowed. Just now, like someone whispering. My blood ran cold. She heard it too, wasn't just me. Yeah, I admitted, the word catching in my throat. Yeah, I heard it. But it's probably nothing. Just echoes. The woods playing tricks. Lame, even to my own ears, but it was the best I could come up with in the moment. Sarah didn't look convinced. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if warding off a chill that wasn't just the cool forest air. Ikus don't whisper, Jake. And they definitely don't sound like they're inside your head. She had a point, a very unsettling point. But I wasn't ready to panic, not yet. We were just tired, on edge. A little spooked by the silence, that's all it was. Look, I said, forcing a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. We came here to camp, right? Let's just set up the tent, build a fire, and relax. Everything will look better in the morning. It was a flimsy plan, but it was a plan nonetheless. And doing something, anything, felt better than just standing there, paralyzed by the oppressive silence and those disembodied whispers. Sarah nodded slowly, still looking around the clearing with a wary expression, but she didn't argue. We moved into the clearing, our boots crunching softly on the mossy ground, the sound strangely loud in the absolute stillness. The clearing was perfectly circular, maybe 50 feet across, ringed by a wall of trees that seemed to lean inwards, as if enclosing us, trapping us within their silent embrace. The ground was uneven, dotted with clumps of ferns and moss-covered rocks, but mostly clear of undergrowth. It was almost too perfect, too manicured, like someone had deliberately cleared the space, swept it clean of life. As we started unpacking our gear, the feeling of unease intensified. The silence was becoming unbearable, a physical weight pressing down on us. My ears started to ring, a high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate in the very air around us. And the light, that pale, unnatural light, it was starting to feel oppressive, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and shifted with every subtle movement. I tried to focus on the task at hand, setting up the tent, laying out our sleeping bags, gathering firewood, routine tasks, things I'd done 100 times before. But even these simple actions felt wrong, here in the clearing. Every movement seemed amplified, clumsy, out of sync with the unnatural stillness around us. It was like trying to move in slow motion, wading through treacle, while the world around you held its breath, waiting. Sarah was even more affected. She moved slowly, mechanically, her face pale and drawn. She kept glancing around, her eyes wide and unfocused, as if she was seeing things that weren't there, or things that I couldn't see. She stumbled once, catching herself on a tree, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Sarah, are you okay?" I asked, my voice sounding strained, even to myself. She shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on something behind me. "I don't feel good, Jake. This place, it feels cold, empty." "It's just the silence," I said, trying to reassure her and myself. "We'll get used to it. Once we get the fire going, it'll be better." But even as I said the words, I knew it was a lie. Fire wouldn't help here. Nothing would help here. This clearing was tainted, corrupted. Something was wrong with this place, fundamentally wrong, and a campfire wasn't going to fix it. We managed to get the tent up, a small dome of bright orange nylon that looked absurdly out of place in the somber green of the clearing. Gathering firewood was harder. The forest floor was strangely devoid of deadwood, as if everything had been meticulously cleared away. We had to break branches off standing trees, branches that felt strangely brittle, almost hollow. As I piled the wood in the center of the clearing, ready to build a fire, I noticed something else. The ground in the clearing, it was bare earth, mostly, but in places it was covered with a thin layer of something white. Not snow, not frost. It was too warm for that, even in the deepening twilight. It was more like ash. Fine white ash, scattered thinly across the ground, like the remnants of some long dead fire. But there was no smell of smoke, no charred wood, no other signs of a fire ever having been here. Just the ash, cold and white against the dark earth. I knelt down, touching it gingerly. It was soft, powdery, almost silky to the touch, and cold. Unnaturally cold, like touching ice, even the warm evening air. I rubbed it between my fingers, and it crumbled into nothingness, leaving a faint, almost imperceptible scent on my skin. A scent that was metallic somehow, like iron or blood. I recoiled, wiping my hand on my pants, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. What was this stuff? And why was it here in this silent clearing? "Jake." Sarah's voice was sharp, urgent. I looked up, startled, and saw her staring at the trees, her face white with fear. "What is it?" I asked, my heart starting to pound. She pointed a trembling finger towards the edge of the clearing, towards the wall of trees that surrounded us. "The trees, they're moving. I followed her gaze, my eyes scanning the dark, silent woods. At first, I didn't see anything, just the trees, tall and still, their branches reaching upwards like skeletal arms against the darkening sky. But then I saw it. A subtle shift, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. A branch, impossibly long and thin, seemed to twitch. Another branch, further down, seemed to bend at an unnatural angle, flexing in the still air. And then I realized it wasn't the branches moving. It was the trees themselves. They were shifting subtly, imperceptibly, but they were moving, leaning inwards towards the clearing towards us, closing in. It was so slow, so gradual, that it was almost impossible to see at first. But once you saw it, once you recognized the pattern, it was undeniable. The trees were alive, and they were moving, surrounding us. I'd been closing us in their silent, watchful embrace. The whisper came again, clearer this time, louder, no longer just a thought, but a voice, a chorus of voices, murmuring just at the edge of hearing. We're here, we're watching, we're waiting. Panic flared in my chest, hot and suffocating. This wasn't just creepy, this was wrong. Dangerously, terrifyingly wrong. We had to get out of here, now. Sarah, I said, my voice tight with fear. We need to go, right now. Pack up the tent, everything. We're leaving. She didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes wide with terror, and started frantically shoving things back into her backpack, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. I scrambled to help her, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the zippers on the tent bag. The trees were still moving, closing in, their shadows lengthening and twisting in the fading light. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent, a chorus of voices murmuring just at the edge of hearing, a sibilant scissorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We're here, we're watching, we're waiting, and now you're here. Here too. We're here, we're watching, we're waiting, and now here too. The whispers were no longer just at the edge of hearing. They were louder now, clearer, coalescing into a distinct voice, or rather voices. Many voices layered and overlapping, speaking in unison, a chorus of sibilant whispers that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. It was like the clearing itself was speaking, the trees, the ground, the very silence itself, all whispering together. Terror lent me a frantic energy. I wrestled with the tent poles, yanking them free from their sockets, the nylon fabric collapsing inwards like a deflated lung. Sarah was moving like a woman possessed, throwing sleeping bags and clothes into her pack, her eyes wide with a primal fear that mirrored my own. We didn't speak, didn't need to. The urgency was unspoken, understood, a desperate race against something unseen, something closing in. The trees were definitely moving now, no longer subtle shifts at the edge of vision, but a slow, deliberate advance. The circle of trees was tightening, the gaps between them shrinking, the shadows deepening and merging into a solid wall of darkness. It was like the forest was a living thing breathing in, constricting, squeezing the air out of the clearing and out of our lungs. We scrambled to our feet, backpacks hastily slung over our shoulders, the tent bag clutched awkwardly in my hand. We had to get back to the trail, back to the car, back to anywhere but here. I turned to face the way we'd come, the path through the trees, but what I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. The path was gone. Where the trail should have been, there was only the wall of trees, indistinguishable from the rest of the forest, solid, impenetrable. It was as if the path had never existed, or as if the forest had simply swallowed it whole. No, Sarah whispered, her voice choked with panic. No. It was just here. The trail of it was right here. She stumbled forward, pushing against the trees, her hands scrabbling at the rough bark, as if she could somehow force the path to reappear. But there was nothing, just trees. Silent, unmoving trees. Their branches intertwined, their leaves rustling softly in a wind we couldn't feel, a wind that carried only whispers. We're here, you're trapped, there's no way out. The voices were closer now, louder, swirling around us, inside us. I could feel them vibrating in my chest, resonating in my teeth. Desperation clawed at me. We couldn't stay here. We couldn't be trapped in this clearing, surrounded by these things. We had to find another way out. Any way out. Okay, I said, forcing myself to speak, to sound calm, even though my voice was trembling. Okay, it's all right. We'll go around. We'll go around the clearing. Find another way back to the trail. It has to be here somewhere. It was a lie, and we both knew it, but it was all I had. We started to move, circling the clearing, keeping close to the edge, our eyes scanning the trees, searching for any break in the wall of green, any sign of a path, any glimmer of hope. But there was nothing. The trees were relentless, an unbroken barrier, pressing in on us, their branches reaching out like grasping claws. The clearing seemed to shrink with every step we took, the circle tightening, the space around us diminishing, as if the woods themselves were exhaling, drawing us deeper into their suffocating embrace. The whispers intensified, growing more louder, no longer just murmurs, but clear, distinct words, spoken in unison by a chorus of voices that were both male and female, young and old, human and something else. We are the forest, we are the silence, we are the watchers, and no, you are ours. Sarah stumbled again, collapsing to her knees, her face buried in her hands, sobs racking her body. I can't do this, Jake. I can't hear them anymore. I knelt beside her, putting my arm around her, pulling her close, trying to offer some comfort, some reassurance, even though I felt like I was drowning in the same terror that was consuming her. It's okay, Sarah. It's okay. We'll get through this. We just have to stay calm. Think. Empty words. Meaningless platitudes in the face of this overwhelming, inexplicable horror. But as I held her, as I looked around at the closing circle of trees, at the lengthening shadows, at the unnatural light that seemed to pulse with a cold, malevolent energy, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that there was no escape. We were trapped. This clearing was a cage, and the forest was the jailer, and we were its prisoners caught in a silent, inescapable nightmare. And then I saw them. At first, it was just movement. A flicker in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Something shifting, something moving among the trees. I strained my eyes, peering into the darkness, trying to make out what it was, and then they stepped into the light. They were figures. Humanoid in shape vaguely, but wrong. Distorted. Twisted, their limbs were too long, too thin, their bodies elongated and gaunt, their skin pale and stretched tight over sharp bones. Their faces, they barely had faces at all. Just shallow depressions where eyes should have been, and thin, lipless slits for mouths. And they were pale, unnaturally pale, like mushrooms bone or mushrooms grown in the dark. They moved slowly, deliberately, gliding rather than walking, their feet barely seeming to touch the ground. They emerged from the trees, one by one, silent, watchful, their featureless faces turned towards us, their empty eye sockets seeming to bore into our souls. There were dozens of them, maybe more, surrounding the clearing, forming a ring around us, mirroring the circle of trees, but closer now, much closer. They were closing in too. We are here. The voices whispered louder now. Almost deafening, a chorus of sibilant sound that filled the clearing, that filled my head, that filled my very being. We are the forest, we are the silence, we are the watchers, and now you are ours, you are one of use. One of them stepped forward, taller than the others, gaunter, more defined, if you could call it definition. It raised a long, skeletal arm pointing a thin bone, like finger at us. Join us. The voices whispered, speaking through it, through all of them, a single voice spoken in a multitude of tones. Join us in the silence, join us in the watching, join us, we are waiting. And then I understood. The clearing wasn't just a clearing. It was something else, something hungry, something that consumed things, absorbed them, changed them. The silence wasn't just silence. It was a part of them, a part of we. And we were the forest. We were the clearing. We were the watchers. And now we were waiting for us to join them, to become one of them, to become part of the silence. Sarah screamed, a raw animal sound of pure terror. I pulled her to her feet, grabbing her hand, knowing, with a despair that was colder than the clearing's unnatural light, that there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. We were trapped. We were surrounded. We were theirs. Run, I yelled, the word tearing from my throat, a futile cry in the face of the inevitable. Run, Sarah, run. And we ran. We ran into the clearing, away from the trees, away from them, even though there was nowhere to go, even though escape was impossible. We ran into the silence, into the waiting embrace of we. And as we ran, the whispers grew louder, closer, surrounding us, engulfing us, until they were no longer whispers at all, but a roar, a deafening chorus that echoed in the silent clearing, that echoed in our minds. that echoed in the very depths of our souls. "Welcome home," we whispered. "Welcome to the silence." And then there was only silence. Too much silence. And we were here. My name is Jake, and my buddy Mark. Well, he's always been the jumpy type. Not in a bad way, you understand. More like keenly observant. He notices things, details most folks would miss. Sometimes it's useful, like when he spotted that buck heading into the tree lane just before hunting season closed. Other times, it's just unnerving. Like that night by the fire. We were deep in the Redwood National Park, California. Classic guy's weekend trip. Escape the city, breathe some real air, maybe catch a fish or two in the Klamath River. Mark and I have been doing these trips since high school. We're not exactly outdoorsmen in the Bear Grylls sense. More like appreciators of nature with a healthy dose of processed snacks and lukewarm beer. This time, we decided to try out a new spot, a little further off the beaten path than usual. Mark had found it on some obscure hiking forum, boasting about secluded campsites and untouched wilderness. Seemed perfect. The drive-in was an experience. Miles of winding roads that snake through towering redwood forests, sunlight barely piercing the canopy even in the middle of the day. It felt like driving into another world, a world older and quieter than anything we were used to. By the time we reached the trailhead, the air was already getting crisp, hinting at the chill of the coming night. The hike itself was tougher than we'd anticipated, a steady uphill climb that left us both panting and sweating, despite the cool air. But the campsite, man, it was worth it. Nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by ancient redwoods that seemed to scrape the sky, it was exactly what we'd hoped for. Complete and utter silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of a stream. We set up camp quickly, our movements practiced and efficient after years of these trips. Tent pitched, sleeping bags unrolled, fire pit cleared. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees, we got the fire going. There's something primal about a campfire, isn't there? The crackle and pop of the burning wood, the flickering flames dancing against the darkness, the warmth radiating outwards, chasing away the encroaching cold. It's comforting, safe, or at least, it's supposed to be. We sat on folding camp chairs, cracking open beers and just soaking it in. The sky deepened into shades of indigo and violet, stars beginning to prick through the darkening canvas. The firelight painted the surrounding trees in shifting patterns of orange and black, turning the familiar shapes of bark and branches into something almost alive. "Man," Mark said, taking a long swig of his beer, "this is the life." Huh. Couldn't agree more. I remember leaning back and letting the fire warm my face. Just what we needed. We talked for a while, mostly just catching up. Work, relationships, the usual guy stuff. The conversation drifted, punctuated by comfortable silences, the kind you only get with someone you've known forever. The fire crackled merrily, casting sparks upwards in the night sky. Everything felt right. Peaceful. Then Mark went quiet. He stopped mid-sentence, his gaze fixed on something beyond the firelight, at the very edge of the clearing where the trees pressed in close. His usual easy grin had vanished, replaced by a furrowed brow and a look of I don't know unease. "What is it?" I asked, following his gaze. "See a bear." He didn't answer right away, just kept staring, his eyes narrowed. The firelight danced and flickered, making the shadows writhe and twist. It was easy to see shapes in the darkness, to imagine things moving just beyond the reach of the flames. But it was just imagination, right? Just the tricks of the light and shadow. "Did you see that?" He finally said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "See what?" I asked again, a little impatient now. "Come on, man, you're freaking me out." He shifted in his chair, turning slightly towards me, but his eyes still flicked back to the shadows. "Something moved," he said. "Over there, by that big redwood, in the shadows." I squinted, trying to see what he was seeing. Nothing, just trees, shadarkness. "Mark, there's nothing there. It's just the woods. Probably a deer or something." He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "It wasn't a deer, it was bigger, and it was watching." I laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Watching. Come on, dude. You're letting your imagination run wild. We're in the middle of nowhere, it's dark, and you're seeing things." He didn't laugh with me. He just kept staring at the shadows, his expression serious, almost scared. "I'm telling you, Jake, I saw something. Something moved. And it wasn't an animal paw." All right, I said, holding up my hands in mock surrender. "Let's say you saw something. What was it foot?" "Aliens. The Redwood Fairy Queen come to bless our campsite." He didn't smile. "I don't know what it was," he said quietly. "But it was there. I swear it." Rolling my eyes, but a tiny seed of unease had been planted in my own mind. Mark wasn't usually this insistent. He was jumpy, sure, but he wasn't prone to outright hallucinations. And there was something in his voice, a sincerity that made it hard to completely dismiss what he was saying. "Okay," I said, trying to sound reasonable. "Let's just keep an eye out, okay? If you see it again, point it out to me. But for now, let's just relax and enjoy the fire." He nodded slowly, still looking unconvinced, but he didn't argue further. We sat in silence for a while, the crackling fire the only sound. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me, telling myself it was just Mark being Mark, just shadows and imagination. But I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the peaceful atmosphere had been subtly, almost imperceptibly disturbed. Then, and it started subtly, almost too subtle to notice at first, a slight rustling of leaves, a soft creaking sound like branches rubbing together in the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still, the flames of the fire burning straight and true. The rustling grew louder, the creaking more pronounced. It wasn't just the leaves now, it was the trees themselves. Or something among them. I glanced at Mark. He was staring at the trees again, his eyes wide now, not with unease but with terror. "Jake," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Do you hear that?" "Yeah," I said, my own voice a little shaky now. "Yeah, I hear it. What the hell is that?" The rustling and creaking intensified, spreading outwards from the edge of the clearing, moving closer. It sounded like the trees themselves were moving. Not swaying in the wind, but shifting, stepping. Closer. The shadows around the firelight seemed to deepen, to become thicker, more solid. The flickering flames danced and wreathed, casting grotesque, elongated shapes that stretched and contorted across the ground. And then I saw it. At the very edge of the firelight, where the shadows were deepest, something moved. Not a rustling in the leaves, not a branch swaying in the wind. Something solid, something dark. Something impossibly large. It was just a fleeting glimpse, a flicker in the periphery, but it was enough. Enough to send a jolt of icy fear straight through my veins. I didn't laugh this time. I didn't dismiss it. Because I saw it too. Something was moving in the shadows. And it wasn't a deer, or a bear, or anything I could explain. And the trees were definitely moving too. The fire crackled, a pathetic little island of light in a sea of encroaching darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum beat against the sudden, suffocating silence that had fallen after Mark's terrified whisper. The rustling, the creaking, the unsettling sense of movement, it had all stopped. But the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by something unseen and malevolent, that had only intensified. I swallowed hard, trying to force down the lump of fear that had lodged in my throat. "Okay," I said, my voice sounding strained and unnatural even to my own ears. "Okay. Maybe it was just the wind picking up. Maybe it's just animals moving around." Mark just stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking in the flickering firelight. He didn't say anything, didn't even nod. His silence was more terrifying than any argument could have been. He knew, just as I was beginning to know, that this wasn't natural. This wasn't wind. This wasn't animals. This was something else. Let's make the fire bigger," I stammered, scrambling to my feet. "Yeah, more light. That'll scare whatever it is away." It sounded weak, even to me, a pathetic attempt to regain control in a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of it. I grabbed a handful of the remaining firewood, the dry redwood snapping and splintering in my trembling hands. I threw it onto the flames, the fire flaring up momentarily, casting a brief, desperate burst of light into the surrounding darkness. For a moment, the shadows receded, pushed back by the sudden surge of heat and light. But it was a temporary reprieve. The darkness pressed in again, heavier, more oppressive than before. As the flames settled back down, I risked another glance at the edge of the clearing. And this time I saw it more clearly. Not just a fleeting glimpse, not just a flicker in the shadows. This time, it was unmistakable. Standing at the edge of the firelight, partially obscured by the dense undergrowth and the massive trunks of the redwoods, was something. It was tall, impossibly tall, towering above the surrounding trees. Its form was indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but I could make out a vague humanoid shape. Long limbs, a hunched posture, massive bulky torso, and eyes. 2 points of light burning like embers in the darkness, fixed on us with an unnerving intensity. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a deer. It was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't be. I gasped, stumbling back, my breath catching in my throat. "Mark," I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. "Mark, look." He followed my gaze, his head swiveling slowly, his eyes widening even further. For a long moment, he just stared, frozen, speechless. Then a low, guttural sound escaped his lips, a sound that was half gasp, half sob. What is that?" He whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what it was. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was dangerous, that it was watching us, that it was interested in us. And then the trees started moving again. This time there was no subtlety to it, no gentle rustling, no soft creaking. This time it was a full-blown cacophony of sound. The trees around us were groaning, cracking, their branches snapping and thrashing as if caught in a violent storm. But there was still no wind. The air was dead still, thick and heavy with a sense of impending dread. The ground beneath us vibrated, a low, rumbling tremor that resonated deep in my chest. It felt like the earth itself was shifting, rearranging itself around us. The trees were not just rustling anymore. They were moving, visibly moving, stepping, closing in. I could see it now, not just hear it. The massive redwoods, ancient and immovable, were swaying, their colossal trunks shifting and turning. It was like watching a forest come alive, animated by some unseen malevolent force. The shadows danced and writhed, no longer just tricks of the firelight, but something tangible, something alive, flowing and swirling around the moving trees. Panic seized me, a cold, paralyzing wave that washed over my mind. Reason fled, replaced by pure, primal fear. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot, unable to move. My mind screamed at me to run, to flee, to escape this nightmare, but my body refused to obey. Mark, however, reacted instantly. Years of jumpiness, of keen observation, had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. He didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't even look at me. He just moved. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over his camp chair with a clatter, and grabbed the backpack that was leaning against the tent. He slung it over his shoulder, his movements jerky and frantic, and turned to me, his eyes wide with terror, but also with a desperate urgency. "Jake, we gotta go, now," he yelled, his voice cracking with fear. His words snapped me out of my paralysis. The sight of his fear, his desperate action, broke through the icy grip of my own terror. He was right, we had to run. Staying here was suicide. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky and weak, and grabbed my own backpack. My hands fumbled with the straps, clumsy and uncoordinated with fear. I couldn't think straight, couldn't remember how to buckle the damn thing.
"Come on, Jake!"
"Hurry!" Mark shouted again, already moving towards the edge of the clearing, away from the encroaching trees, away from the shadowy figure that still stood watching us from the darkness. I finally managed to get my backpack on, the straps digging into my shoulders, the weight feeling heavier than it ever had before. I turned to follow Mark, my eyes darting wildly around, trying to take in everything at once. The moving trees, the deepening shadows, the unseen presence that was closing in on us. And then I saw it again, the shadowy figure at the edge of the firelight. It had moved. It was closer now, no longer partially obscured by the trees. It was standing in the open just beyond the reach of the flames, and I could see it more clearly now. It was huge. Bigger than any man, bigger than any bear I'd ever imagined. Its form was still indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but I could make out details now. Long spindly limbs, ending in massive, clawed hands. A hunched back, covered in what looked like matted fur or moss. And a head, if it could be called a head, a shapeless mass of darkness with those two burning eyes, glowing like embers in the night. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else. Something ancient and terrible. Something that had no place in the world we knew. And as I stared at it, frozen in terror, it moved. It took a step forward, out of the shadows and into the firelight, and as it moved, the trees around us seemed to sway and bend in response, as if bowing to its presence. The ground trembled again, the rumbling growing louder, more insistent. The air grew colder, a sudden, sharp chill that pierced through my clothes, raising goosebumps on my skin. A strange, musky odor filled the air, acrid and unsettling, like damp earth and something rotten. And then it made a sound, a low, guttural growl that resonated deep within my bones, a sound that spoke of ancient hunger and unimaginable power. It was a sound that promised pain, that promised death. A sound that told me, in no uncertain terms, that we were no longer alone in the woods, that we were prey. And the trees were moving closer, and the shadow figure was stepping out of the darkness. And we were trapped. Run! Mark screamed, his voice cracking, a raw edge of pure terror in it. He didn't need to tell me twice. My legs finally found their purpose, fear overriding the paralysis. I turned and ran, stumbling blindly away from the fire, away from the creature, away from the trees that were now closing in like living walls. The darkness swallowed me whole the moment I left the firelight. Gone was the flickering orange glow, replaced by an oppressive, absolute blackness that pressed in from all sides. I could hear Mark crashing through the undergrowth ahead of me, his panicked breaths and the snapping of branches the only guide in the suffocating dark. I followed the sound, my own breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The forest floor was uneven, treacherous. Roots snagged at my boots, low-hanging branches whipped at my face. Unseen obstacles loomed in the darkness, threatening to trip me with every step. I stumbled, nearly fell, my arms flailing wildly for balance. Fear lent me a desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength, pushing me forward, forcing my legs to keep moving even as my lungs burned and my muscles screamed in protest. Behind us, the forest was alive with sound. The groaning and creaking of the moving trees intensified, a symphony of unnatural movement that echoed through the darkness. Mixed with it was a new sound, a heavy, rhythmic thudding, like giant footsteps pounding on the earth. The creature was following us. It was hunting us, faster. Mark yelled from somewhere ahead, his voice strained, barely audible above the cacophony of the forest. It's gaining on us. I pushed myself harder, digging deep, finding reserves of energy I didn't know I possessed. The trees whipped past in a blur of black shapes, the darkness a tangible presence, pressing in, suffocating. I could feel the creature behind us, not just hear it. A sense of immense weight, of ancient power radiated from the darkness, a palpable wave of dread that washed over me, chilling me to the core. We ran for what felt like an eternity, stumbling blindly through the darkness, guided only by sound and fear. The ground sloped upwards, the climb becoming steeper, more arduous. My lungs burned, my legs ached, my vision swam with black spots. I was gasping for breath, my body screaming for rest, but I knew we couldn't stop. Not yet, not ever, maybe. Ahead, a faint glimmer of light flickered through the trees. Hope surged through me. A fragile spark in the overwhelming darkness, firelight another campsite. Salvation. Light. I gasped, pointing towards the glimmer, my voice hoarse and weak. Mark, light. Over there. Mark veered towards the light, his pace quickening, desperation lending him a renewed burst of speed. We crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at our clothes. Thorns ripping at our skin, heedless of the pain, driven only by the desperate need to reach the light, to escape the darkness, to escape the thing that was hunting us. We burst through the trees and into a small clearing, and there it was. Not Salvade fire, but the moon. A full moon hanging high in the inky sky, bathing the clearing in an eerie, silver light. The clearing was small, surrounded by the same towering redwoods that had haunted our campsite, but here, in the moonlight, they seemed different. Less menacing, somehow. Or maybe it was just the illusion of light, a brief respite from the suffocating darkness of the forest. We stumbled into the clearing, collapsing onto the mussy ground, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. We lay there for a moment, chests heavy, lungs burning, the silence of the clearing a stark contrast to the chaotic sounds of the forest behind us. Then Mark pointed, his hand shaking, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of terror. "Jake," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look." I followed his gaze, my eyes scanning the edge of the clearing, where the trees pressed in close again. And there it was, standing at the edge of the moonlight, just beyond the reach of the silver glow, was the creature. It was no longer shrouded in shadow. Here, in the moonlight, I could see it clearly. And what I saw of it was worse than any nightmare I could have imagined. It was tall, impossibly tall, easily 15 feet, maybe more. Its limbs were long and spinally, grotesquely elongated, ending in massive, clawed hands that dragged on the ground. Its torso was bulky, hunched, covered in a thick matting of dark, moss-like fur. And its head, it was a shapeless mass of darkness, dominated by those two burning eyes, glowing with an inner, malevolent light. Its skin, where I could see it beneath the fur, was a sickly, grayish, white, stretched taut over bone and muscle. It was gaunt, emaciated, like something starved and ancient, something that had been lurking in the shadows for centuries, waiting for prey. It wasn't Bigfoot, not like any picture or grainy video I'd ever seen. This was something twisted, corrupted, something ancient and wrong, something that had been born of the darkness of the deep woods, something that should never have been seen by human eyes. Bigfoot. That was the only word that came to mind. A childish, ridiculous name for something so utterly terrifying, but it fit somehow. It was big. It was in the woods. And it was hungry. It stood there at the edge of the moonlight, watching us, those burning eyes fixed on us with an unnerving intensity. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, a silent, looming presence of pure dread. And then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one of its massive, clawed hands. It pointed a long, skeletal finger directly at us. And in that moment knew we weren't going to escape. This clearing wasn't a refuge, it was a cage. And we were trapped inside, with the monster at the door. We scrambled back to our feet, stumbling backwards, away from the creature, away from the edge of the moonlight, deeper into the clearing. There was nowhere to run. The trees surrounded us, the creature blocked our escape, and the darkness was closing in. The last thing I saw, before the darkness swallowed us whole, was those two burning eyes glowing in the moonlight, watching us with cold, ancient hunger. And then the trees moved again, and the shadows closed in, and the world went black. They found our campsite the next day. The fire was still smoldering, the tent ripped to shreds, our gear scattered and broken. But there was no sign of us, no bodies, no blood, just empty space. They say people still go missing in Redwood National Park. Hikers, campers, wanderers who stray too far from the marked trails. They say the woods are deep and dangerous, full of wild animals and hidden dangers, and they're right. But they don't know the real danger. They don't know about the thing in the shadows. They don't know about Bigfoot, and I hope, for their sake, they never do. Because some shadows are best left undisturbed, and some things are best left unseen, and some woods are just hungry. My name's Alex, and honestly, if you were to ask anyone who knows me, they'd probably describe me as, well, maybe unlucky is too strong a word. Let's go with prone to weirdness. Things just happen around me. Not always bad things, mind you, but definitely things that make you tilt your head and go, huh, that's odd. Like the time a flock of pigeons decided my car was the perfect place for a midday conference, leaving it looking like it had been snowed on with bird droppings in the middle of July. Or the week my phone only translated everything into Klingon. Seriously, Klingon. I didn't even know my phone could do that. So, when I decided to go on a solo camping trip deep in the Redwood National Park, maybe it wasn't the smartest move given my track record. But I needed it. Needed to get away from the city, the noise, the constant hum of, well, everything. My life had become a tangled mess of deadlines, unanswered emails, and the persistent feeling that I was forgetting something crucial even when I wasn't. The redwoods, with their ancient silence and towering majesty, seemed like the perfect antidote. A digital detox, a nature reset, a chance to just breathe. I'd spent weeks planning, researched trails, packed and repacked my gear until my living room looked like an REI exploded, and even downloaded one of those nature sounds apps to get myself in the mood. Pathetic, I know, but city living does things to you. You forget what real quiet sounds like. The drive up was beautiful. Highway 101 snaking along the coast, the Pacific a shimmering blue on one side, and the redwood forest rising like green cathedrals on the other. By the time I reached the trailhead, the air was already cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. I hoisted my pack, adjusted the straps, and took a deep breath, feeling the city tension start to loosen its grip. The trail I'd chosen was supposed to be moderately challenging, a loop that would take me about 2 days, leading to a secluded campsite near a creek. Perfect, I thought. Secluded. Exactly what I needed. The first few hours were bliss. Sunlight dappled through the canopy, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the trail. I even saw a deer, a doe with impossibly long eyelashes, who paused to watch me before gracefully melting back into the undergrowth. As the afternoon wore on, the forest deepened. The sunlight thinned, replaced by a cool, green twilight even at midday. The trees grew taller, thicker, their bark a deep, reddish-brown, scarred and ancient. It was beautiful, awe-inspiring, but also a little unnerving. There was a weight to the silence here, a sense of something old and watchful. I started to feel like I was being observed, though whenever I stopped and scanned the trees, there was nothing but more trees, stretching endlessly into the shadows. I reached the campsite later than I'd planned. The trail had been steeper and more overgrown than the guide had suggested, and the fading light was starting to make me hurry. The campsite itself was small, just a cleared patch of ground nestled beside a gurgling creek. Perfectly isolated, I quickly set up my tent, fumbling a bit in the gathering gloom. Hunger gnawed at me, but the thought of cooking in the near dark didn't appeal. I settled for a protein bar and some water, promising myself a proper hot meal in the morning. The air grew colder as dusk deepened into night. The forest sounds changed, the daytime chirps and rustles replaced by deeper, rustling sounds, the hoot of an owl somewhere far off, and the constant murmur of the creek. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it up tight, and lay there, listening to the sounds of the woods. It was different from the Nature Sounds app, that was for sure. This was real, raw, alive. At first, it was comforting. The sounds of nature, the feeling of being small and insignificant in the face of something so vast and old. But as the hours passed, a different feeling started to creep in. A prickle of unease, a sense of wrongness. It was subtle at first, just a whisper at the edge of my awareness. Like a note played slightly off, key in a beautiful melody. I couldn't put my finger on it. There was no specific sound that was out of place, no sudden movement in the shadows. It was just a feeling, a growing sense that something wasn't right. The silence, which had been so peaceful earlier, now felt heavy, oppressing back. I shifted in my sleeping bag, trying to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just fatigue, the long hike, the unfamiliar surroundings. Maybe it was just my overactive imagination, my prone to weirdness brain kicking into overdrive. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on my breathing, to meditate myself into sleep. But the feeling persisted, and then I started to hear it. Faint at first, almost subliminal. A whisper carried on the night air. Too soft to be the wind, too indistinct to be an animal. Just a sibilant murmur weaving in and out of the other forest sounds. I strained my ears, trying to isolate it. Was it just the creek, the rustling leaves? Or was it something else, something closer? The whisper seemed to ebb and flow, sometimes fading to almost nothing, then rising again, just at the edge of hearing. It didn't sound like words, not exactly, more like sounds shaped like words, the barest suggestion of syllables, too low, too indistinct to understand. But there was a quality to it, a resonance that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. It felt intentional, like something was trying to communicate, or maybe just trying to be heard. I told myself it was nothing. Just the wind playing tricks, the forest playing tricks, my own mind playing tricks. But the whisper persisted, weaving its way into my thoughts, coloring the silence with a growing sense of dread. It was like the woods themselves were breathing, sighing, whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. And then, just as I was starting to convince myself it was all in my head, the whisper changed. It grew slightly louder, clearer, and for the first time, I thought I could almost make out a word. Just a fragment, a syllable, lost in the rustling leaves and the murmur of the creek. But it was there, hanging in the air, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. The syllable was cold. It wasn't spoken aloud, not in the way you or I would speak. It was still a whisper, but now with a definite shape, a distinct form. And the moment I heard it, a sudden chill went through me, deeper than the night air, colder than the creek water. It settled in my bones, a creeping, icy dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. I lay there frozen, listening, my heart hammering against my ribs. The whisper faded again, swallowed by the night sounds. But the feeling remained, the cold dread seeping deeper, the sense of wrongness intensifying. The woods were silent again, but it was a different silence now. A silence that felt expectant, waiting. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the core that I was no longer alone. Not really. Something was out there in the dark, listening, watching, whispering. And whatever it was close. Closer than I wanted it to be. Closer than I could possibly imagine. I woke up with a gasp, my body convulsing with a sudden, bone-deep chill. It wasn't just the cold of the night air. This was something else, something that felt like it was coming from inside me, radiating outwards, freezing me from the marrow. My teeth chattered uncontrollably, and my breath hitched in my chest, each inhale a painful stab of icy air. Disoriented, I blinked in the darkness, my eyes struggling to adjust. The inside of the tent was pitch black, the nylon walls offering little protection from the oppressive night. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, the sudden cold and the lingering unease from the whispers in the woods blurring my senses. Then, the murmur of the creek, a constant low gurgle just outside the tent, brought it all rushing back. Redwood National Park, solo camping, the whispers, panic flared, hot and sharp against the unnatural cold. I fumbled for my headlamp, my fingers clumsy and numb. Clicking it on, a weak beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior of the tent in a pale, shaky circle. The first thing I noticed was my sleeping bag. It was unzipped. Completely unzipped. The zipper lay open, the fabric pulled apart as if someone had deliberately undone it. But I always zipped my sleeping bag up tight. Always. It was a habit, a comfort thing. A small defense against the things that go bump in the night, even when those things are just squirrels and raccoons. I distinctly remembered zipping it up before I drifted off. The reassuring sound of the zipper teeth locking together, a final act of self-care before sleep. My heart started to pound harder, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I scrambled to sit up, pulling the unzipped sleeping bag around me like a flimsy shield. My breath fogged in the cold air. The tent felt colder than it should have, colder than the outside air had felt when I'd set up camp. It was as if the chill was emanating from within the tent itself, seeping up from the ground, radiating from the very fabric of the nylon. Taking a shaky breath, I reached for the tent zipper, my hand trembling. I had to see outside, had to understand what was going on. With a jerky movement, I unzipped the tent door, the sound of the zipper loud in the unnatural quiet. The outside air hit me like a physical blow, a wave of icy cold that stole my breath. The forest was shrouded in darkness, deeper and more absolute than anything I'd experienced before. The beam of my headlamp seemed swallowed by the blackness, illuminating only a small circle of ground just outside the tent flap. Beyond that, nothing but impenetrable shadow. The creek gurgled nearby, a constant unsettling sound in the oppressive silence. The trees loomed around the campsite, their massive forms barely visible in the darkness, their branches like skeletal arms reaching down. The feeling of being watched intensified, a palpable weight in the air, pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then I saw them. Footprints, muddy footprints leading away from the tent. They started right at the edge of the tent flap, clearly defined in the damp earth, dark smudges against the lighter soil. Small, bare footprints heading away from the campsite, deeper into the woods. My blood ran cold, colder even than the unnatural chill that had woken me. Bare footprints. In the mud, leading away from my tent, but I was alone. I was the only one here. There was no one else to make those footprints. Unless I wasn't alone. Unless something had been here. Something that had unzipped my sleeping bag while I slept. Something that had stood just outside my tent, watching me, breathing the same cold night air. Something that had left these small, bare footprints in the mud. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, to find a rational explanation. Sleepwalking. Could I have sleepwalked? Unzipped my own sleeping bag, walked out of the tent barefoot in the middle of the night, and then what? Just wandered off into the woods. It seemed impossible. I'd never sleepwalked before, not that I knew of. And even if I had, would I have walked away from the tent? Into the darkness. And the cold. The unnatural bone-chilling cold. That wasn't sleepwalking. That was something else. Something wrong. I shone my headlamp along the line of footprints, following them with a weak beam. They led away from the campsite, towards the deeper woods, disappearing into the shadows under the dense canopy. They were small, definitely smaller than my own feet, narrow and strangely delicate. Not like animal tracks, not like human footprints exactly. Something in between. Or something else entirely. The whisper from earlier echoed in my memory, the cold syllable hanging in the air, cold. It wasn't just the temperature. It was something else, something connected to these footprints, to the unzipped sleeping bag, to the oppressive silence of the woods. Fear, raw and primal, gripped me. This wasn't just weirdness anymore. This was something darker, something more sinister. The woods weren't just silent, they were listening. They weren't just dark, they were hiding something. And whatever it was, it had been inside my tent. It had been close. Too close. My breath hitched again, a ragged gasp in the cold air. I had to get out of here. Now. This campsite, this forest, this whole place, it felt wrong. Dangerously wrong. Every instinct screamed to me to pack up, to leave, to run as far and as fast as I could. But run where? It was the middle of the night. Deep in the wilderness. The trailhead was hours away, hours of hiking through this darkness, through these woods that now felt hostile, watchful, alive in a way that was deeply unsettling. And those footprints, where did they lead? What was out there in the darkness beyond the reach of my headlamp? I hesitated, frozen by indecision and fear. Part of me wanted to pack everything up and just start walking, blindly stumbling through the woods, hoping to find my way back to the trail, back to safety, back to anywhere but here. But another part of me, a terrified, irrational part, was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of it all. What if whatever had made those footprints was still out there, watching me, waiting for me to leave the tent, waiting till what? The silence pressed in, heavy and expectant. The creek gurgled, a mocking, indifferent sound. The trees loomed, their shadows shifting and swaying in the darkness, playing tricks on my eyes, making me see things that weren't there, or were they? Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, making me jump, making me spin around, my headlamp beam frantically searching the shadows. But there was nothing, just trees, just darkness, just the cold, and the silence, and the growing, suffocating dread. And the footprints leading away into the blackness, a silent, undeniable sign that I was not alone. That something had been here. Something was still here, and it was waiting. The beam of my headlamp trembled in my hand, shaking as badly as I was. I forced myself to take a slow, deliberate breath, trying to regain some semblance of control. Panic wouldn't help. Freezing in terror wouldn't help. I had to think, had to act. But what could I do? Staying in the tent felt like waiting to be caught in a trap. The unzipped sleeping bag, the footprints, it felt like an invitation or maybe a warning. Like whatever had been here wanted me to know it had been here, wanted me to be afraid. And it was working. Oh God, it was working. But running blindly into the woods in the middle of the night seemed even worse. The darkness out there was absolute, the trees looming like silent sentinels, the shadows alive with unseen possibilities. Those footprints led deeper into that darkness. Following them felt like walking willingly into something. I glanced back at the tent, the flimsy nylon walls suddenly seeming utterly inadequate, offering no real protection at all. It was just a thin barrier between me and whatever was out there, in the cold, silent woods, and it hadn't even kept my sleeping bag zipped. Decision made, staying was not an option. Better to risk the darkness, better try and find my way back to the trail than to wait here, paralyzed by fear for whatever was coming. And something was coming. I could feel it in the air, in the oppressive silence, in the unnatural cold that seemed to seep from the very ground. With jerky movements, I started to pack. My hands were clumsy and numb, fumbling with zippers and straps, my fingers stiff with cold and fear. Every rustle of the tent fabric, every clink of my gear, sounded deafeningly loud in the stillness, like a beacon, announcing my presence to whatever was listening. I kept glancing towards the edge of the campsite, towards the line of footprints disappearing into the shadows. My headlamp beam danced nervously, trying to pierce the darkness, but it was useless. The woods swallowed the light, revealing nothing but more trees, more shadows, more oppressive blackness. As I packed, the whispering started again. Fainter now, almost inaudible, but still there. weaving in and out of the night sounds, a sibilant murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It felt closer now, somehow more pervasive, like the woods themselves were whispering, the trees themselves were sighing, the very air was humming with an unseen presence. And then the whispers changed again. They grew slightly louder, clearer, and this time there was no mistaking it. It wasn't just a syllable, not just a fragment of a word. It was a word, two words, whispered on the cold night air, carried on the wind, or something that sounded like wind but wasn't. Come closer. The words were faint, breathy, almost childlike, but with an undercurrent of something ancient, something cold and utterly alien. They seemed to resonate in my bones, vibrating in my chest, chilling me to the core. Come closer. It wasn't a question, not a request. It was an invitation, a command. My blood turned to ice. I froze halfway through stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack, my hands still and trembling. Come closer. The whispers repeated, softer now, almost pleading, but no less chilling. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stay here, listening to those whispers, feeling that cold, oppressive presence closing in. But my feet were rooted to the spot, my body locked in place by a fear so profound it was almost physical. Come closer. The whispers murmured again, closer now, definitely closer. I could almost feel them on my skin, like icy breath, like the touch of frozen fingers. We're waiting. We're waiting. Plural. It wasn't just one thing out there. There was more than one. More than one of whatever was making those footprints, whispering in the dark, unzipping sleeping bags in the middle of the night. And they were waiting for me to come closer. My breath hitched in my throat, a silent sob of terror. I had to move, had to break free from this paralysis, had to escape. But where could I go? The footprints led into the woods. The whispers came from the woods. The danger was in the woods, and the only way out was through the woods. Taking a shuddering breath, I forced myself to move. I finished packing. My movements jerky and frantic, my eyes darting around the campsite, searching the shadows, expecting to see something. But there was nothing. Just trees, just darkness, just the whispers, growing fainter now, receding back into the woods, as if drawing me after them. With my pack finally secured, I grabbed my hiking poles, their metal tips cold and reassuring in my trembling hands. I clipped my headlamp to my forehead, adjusted the beam, and took another deep breath, trying to steel myself for what was to come. I had to follow the trail. Had to find my way back to the trailhead. It was the only way out. But the trail led through the woods, through the darkness, through the whispers. And the footprints, they led away from the trail, deeper into the heart of the forest. For a moment, I hesitated, torn between the known path and the unknown danger. Should I follow the footprints? Should I try to understand what they were, where they led? Or should I stick to the trail, try to escape, try to outrun whatever was out there? The whispers returned, closer now, louder, no longer faint and breathy, but sharp and clear, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Come closer, Alex. My name. They knew my name. How could they know my name? Terror surged, overwhelming my reason, obliterating any lingering sense of logic or control. They knew my name. They were waiting for me. And they were calling me. Not just inviting, not just commanding, but calling. Like a summons, a beckoning, a lure. And something inside me, something cold and terrified and utterly irrational, wanted to answer that call. Wanted to go to them, to see what was waiting in the darkness, to understand the whispers, to follow the footprints in the unknown. No, I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear that was clouding my mind. No, that was madness. That was death. I had to get out of here. Had to get back to the trail, back to safety, back to the world of light and reason and human voices. Ignoring the whispers, ignoring the footprints, ignoring the cold dread that was pulling me towards the darkness, I turned my back on the campsite, turned my back on the woods, and started to walk. Not towards the trail, not yet, but away from the footprints, away from the whispers, away from the heart of the forest. I walked blindly, stumbling through the darkness, my headlamp beam cutting a narrow swath through the trees. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. Just away. Just further and further away from the campsite, from the tent, from the footprints, from the whispers that still echoed in my mind, calling my name, urging me to come closer. The ground sloped downwards, the trees grew thicker, the darkness deepened. The creek gurgled somewhere behind me, its sound fading into the distance. The whispers faded too, becoming fainter and fainter, until finally they were gone. Or were they? Were they really gone, or were they just waiting, watching, letting me run, knowing that eventually I would have to stop, knowing that eventually the darkness would catch me? I kept walking, pushing myself forward, driven by a desperate, primal need to escape. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until I was sure I was safe. Not until I was sure the whispers were truly gone. And then through the trees, through the darkness, I saw it. A faint glimmer of light, a pale, ethereal glow, barely visible in the oppressive blackness. Trail markers, reflective trail markers, catching the weak beam of my headlamp, guiding me back to the path, back to the way out. Relief flooded through me, so intense it almost brought me to my knees. I wasn't lost. I wasn't trapped. There was a way out. There was a trail. And the trail led somewhere. Anywhere was better than here. With renewed determination, I stumbled towards the trail markers, my pace quickening, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, but it was there. A path through the woods, a way back to civilization, back to safety. I followed the trail, my headlamp beam fixed on the reflective markers, guiding me through the darkness. The woods were still silent, still watchful, but the oppressive dread had lessened, replaced by a fragile, flickering hope. Maybe I would make it out. Maybe I would escape. Maybe the whispers were just a nightmare, a figment of my overactive imagination, a trick of the night. But then, just as the first faint hint of dawn started to lighten the eastern sky, just as I started to believe I might actually be safe, I saw them again. Footprints. Muddy footprints. On the trail now, right in front of me. Small, bare footprints, heading in the same direction I was, leading me further down the trail, deeper into the woods. And they weren't just footprints anymore. They were wet, freshly made. As if something had just walked this way just ahead of me on the trail I was following. And as I stared at those fresh, wet footprints in the mud, a whisper, no longer faint, no longer distant, but right behind me, right in my ear, cold and sharp and utterly terrifying, breathed my name. Alex. And then I felt it. A cold touch on my shoulder. Icy fingers closing around my arm. A grip that was both gentle and impossibly strong, pulling me back into the darkness, back into the woods, back into the cold embrace of whatever had been waiting for me all along. And then there was only cold and silence, and the whispers welcoming me home. My name's Jake, and I've always been drawn to the kind of places most folks avoid. Give me a map marked unexplored, a trail that fades into whispers and rumors, and I'm practically packing my bags before you finish the sentence. It's not that I'm fearless, exactly. More like curious. Maybe a little too curious for my own good, as it turns out. This particular adventure started, like many bad decisions, with a group of friends, a long weekend and the irresistible pull of the unknown. There were 4 of us, me, Liam, Sarah, and Emily. Liam, my childhood buddy, is the pragmatic one, always double-checking gear and weather forecasts. Sarah, Liam's girlfriend, is the group's historian and documentarian, armed with a vintage camera and an insatiable appetite for local lore. Emily, Sarah's best friend and a recent transplant to our town, was the wild-card adventurous, impulsive, and always up for pushing boundaries. We were heading into the Redwood National Park, a place where sunlight struggles to touch the forest floor and ancient trees stand sentinel over a world that feels both timeless and deeply unsettling. We weren't sticking to the well-trodden tourist paths. No, we were aiming for the Lost Creek Trail, a less maintained route that snaked deeper into the woods, promising solitude and a taste of genuine wilderness. Sarah had found it on some obscure online forum dedicated to hidden gems and uncharted territories. The forum posts spoke of breathtaking vistas, hidden waterfalls, and a sense of isolation that was both exhilarating and vaguely unnerving. Of course, they also mentioned the occasional unexplained phenomena and strange occurrences. But Sarah, ever the romantic, dismissed those as local color, adding to the trail's allure rather than deterring us. Imagine the photos, Jake, she'd exclaimed, waving her phone in my face, displaying grainy images of towering redwoods shrouded in mist. No crowds, just us in nature, and maybe a ghost story or two. Liam, ever the voice of reason, had raised an eyebrow. The unexplained phenomena sounds a lot like beers and mountain lions to me, Sarah. But Emily, predictably, was already sold. Ghost stories, hidden waterfalls. I'm in. Let's ditch the crowds and find some real adventure. And so the plan was set. Friday afternoon, we packed Liam's trusty SUV with camping gear, trail snacks, and Sarah's collection of vintage maps and compasses set because, as she put it, relying solely on GPSs for amateurs. By nightfall, we were setting up camp at the designated trailered parking lot, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The trailhead itself was marked by a weathered wooden sign, half obscured by overgrown ferns. Lost Creek Trail experience hikers only. Below, in faded paint, someone had scrawled, "Turn back." We exchanged nervous glances, but no one voiced any second thoughts. We were past the point of turning back, metaphorically and literally. The first day of hiking was everything we'd hoped for, and more. The trail was challenging, winding through dense undergrowth and across moss-covered fallen logs. Sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy, casting long, eerie shadows that danced and shifted with every rustle of leaves. The air was heavy with humidity, and the silence was profound, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the distant call of an unseen bird. Sarah was in her element, snapping photos of everything, colossal trees that dwarfed us, delicate fungi clinging to damp bark, and the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. Emily, despite a few stumbles and complaints about her ill-chosen hiking boots, was energized by the rugged terrain, bounding ahead like an eager puppy. Liam, as always, was the steady anchor, setting a measured pace and keeping us on track. As for me, I was soaking it all in. The primeval atmosphere, the sense of being utterly removed from the modern world. There was something undeniably captivating about these woods, a feeling of ancient power and hidden secrets. But beneath the surface of awe and excitement, I couldn't shake a faint undercurrent of unease. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. We hiked for hours, stopping only for brief water breaks and to consult Sarah's maps, which were proving to be more decorative than practical. The trail markers were infrequent and faded, and several times we had to backtrack and reorient ourselves. As the afternoon wore on, the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper, and the silence more oppressive. It was Emily who first spotted it. "Hey guys, look," she called out, pointing through a thicket of ferns. "Is that a cabin?" We pushed through the undergrowth, and there it was. Nestled in a small clearing, partially hidden by trees, stood a small, dilapidated cabin. It was old, constructed from rough-hewn logs, with a steeply pitched roof covered in moss and lichen. The windows were dark and empty, and the wooden door sagged on its hinges. It looked utterly abandoned, a relic of a bygone era, swallowed by the relentless embrace of the forest. "Whoa," Sarah breathed, lowering her camera. "Creepy." Liam circled the cabin cautiously, peering into the darkened windows. "Looks deserted," his voice echoing in the stillness. "Definitely seen better days." But then I saw it. A thin plume of pale smoke, rising lazily from the chimney, barely visible against the darkening sky. Fresh smoke. We all saw it at the same moment, and the silence that followed was thick with unspoken questions and a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the approaching evening. Abandoned, maybe not. The smoke was faint, almost ethereal, but undeniably there. It curled upwards from the chimney of the dilapidated cabin, a ghostly signal in the deepening twilight. We stood frozen, the four of us, staring at that wisp of smoke as if it were a venomous snake coiled in our path. The forest, which had been merely quiet moments before, now seemed to hold its breath, amplifying the sudden tension that had gripped us. "Did you see that?" Her voice barely audible. Smoke. Coming from the chimney. Lever from Liam, ever the pragmatist, squinted at the cabin, his usual composure momentarily ruffled. "Yeah, I see it, but that's impossible, right? This place is supposed to be abandoned." Sarah, who had been so eager for ghost stories just hours ago, now looked genuinely unnerved. Her camera hung forgotten at her side. Maybe it's just some kind of weird natural phenomenon, like mist that looks like smoke. I wanted to believe her, I really did, but the smoke was too consistent, too deliberate in its upward drift. It wasn't mist, it was smoke. "It's smoke, Sarah," I said, my voice low. Someone's inside. The realization hung heavy in the air. Someone was in that cabin, deep in the woods, miles from the nearest trail marker, in a place supposedly lost to time, and that someone was making a fire. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over me, curiosity warring with apprehension, excitement battling a growing sense of dread. Part of me, the adventure seeker, was thrilled. This was it, the unexplained phenomenon Sarah half joked about. This was the real story, the kind that made those online forums buzz with speculation and whispered theories. But another part of me, the part that was starting to listen to that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, was screaming at me to turn around, to retreat back to the familiar safety of the marked trail. Liam broke the silence, his voice regaining some of its usual steadiness, though I could still detect a note of caution. Okay, let's not jump to conclusions. It could be another hiker. Maybe someone got lost, or needed shelter. His explanation sounded flimsy even to my own ears. Lost hikers didn't typically build fires in abandoned cabins, and if someone was seeking shelter, why choose a place so far off the beaten path? A place that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Emily, however, seemed to be leaning into the mystery with an almost reckless enthusiasm. Or maybe it's a hermit, she exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. Like a real-life, woods-dwelling hermit, we should go say hey. Emily, are you crazy? Sarah snapped, finally shaking off her initial shock. We have no idea who's in there. It could be dangerous. Emily scoffed. Come on, Sarah, lighten up. It's probably just some old guy living off the grid. What's the worst that could happen? I exchanged a look with Liam. Emily's impulsiveness, usually a source of amusement, now felt unsettlingly naive. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from civilization, and we were talking about approaching a stranger in a secluded, dilapidated cabin in the woods. This wasn't a friendly encounter waiting to happen. This felt like the beginning of a very bad idea. We should at least check it out, I said, trying to strike a balance between Emily's reckless curiosity and Sarah's understandable fear. We don't have to go inside, but we should at least see who's there. Maybe they do need help. Liam nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. All right, but we stick together, and we're cautious. No sudden moves, no loud noises. We just observe. If it feels wrong, we back off. Agreed. Sarah, still looking pale, nodded reluctantly. Emily, however, was already grinning, practically bouncing on the balls of her feet. Agreed. Let's go cabin exploring. We approached the cabin slowly, cautiously, moving as quietly as we could through the undergrowth. The air grew colder as we neared the clearing, the shadows deepening around us. The only sound was the rustling of leaves under our boots and the frantic thumping of my own heart. As we got closer, details of the cabin began to emerge from the gloom. The logs were indeed old and weathered, some rotting and crumbling at the edges. Moss and lichen clung to every surface, giving the structure a sickly, organic look, as if it were slowly being consumed by the forest itself. The windows were more than just dark. They were coated in grime and cobwebs, obscuring any view of the interior. The door, hanging crooked on one hinge, was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible within. And then there was the smell. It was faint, but unmistakable wood smoke, yes, but mingled with something else, something acrid. It was a harsh chemical scent, underlying the comforting aroma of burning wood, a discordant note that set my teeth on edge. We stopped at the edge of the clearing, concealed behind a screen of ferns, and peered at the cabin. The smoke continued to rise from the chimney, a thin, pale ribbon against the darkening sky. There was no other sign of life, no movement, no sound. Just the smoke, the silence, and that unsettling, acrid smell. Hello, Emily called out, her voice echoing in the stillness, far louder than Liam had intended. Is anyone there? Silence. Only the rustling of leaves in the wind answered her. Hello, she called again, louder this time, stepping out of the ferns and into the clearing. We're hiker, we just wanted to see if you were okay. Still silence. The cabin remained inert, a dark, brooding presence in the heart of the woods. Liam grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her back towards us. Emily, stop. You don't know what you're doing. But maybe they need help, she protested, shaking him off. Maybe they're hurt or something. Or maybe, Sarah interjected, her voice trembling slightly. Maybe they don't want to be found. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. We looked at the cabin again, at the dark windows, the sagging door, the plume of smoke that seemed to mock our presence. And for the first time, a truly chilling thought took root in my mind. Maybe we weren't just intruding on someone's solitude. Maybe we're stumbling into something far more sinister. The smoke, no longer just a curious anomaly, now seemed like a warning, a signal. And the silence of the cabin, once just an absence of sound, now felt like a deliberate, watchful stillness. We were being observed. I could feel it, a cold, prickling certainty that settled deep in my bones. We were not alone, and whoever or whatever was in that cabin was not welcoming visitors. Sarah's words hung in the air, heavy with a dread that resonated with us all. Maybe they don't want to be found. The silence from the cabin was not just empty, it was charge expectant. It felt like the woods themselves were listening, waiting to see what we would do next. The playful curiosity that had driven us was gone, replaced by a primal unease that urged us to retreat, to vanish back into the anonymity of the forest. Liam, ever the responsible one, finally made the call. That's it. We've seen enough. Let's head back to the trail, set up camp properly, and figure out what to do in the morning. He didn't say report this, but the unspoken implication was clear. This was beyond our weekend adventure. This was something else. I nodded, relief washing over me. Sarah looked visibly grateful, and even Emily, though a flicker of disappointment crossed her face, didn't argue. Turning our backs on the cabin felt like shedding a heavy weight. We started to retrace our steps, moving quickly now, eager to put distance between ourselves and that unsettling place. But as we turned to leave, a sound broke the silence. A faint creaking like a door slowly opening. We froze again, turning back to face the cabin. The sagging wooden door, which had been slightly ajar, was now opening wider, inch by agonizing inch. Darkness yawned from within, a deeper black than the surrounding shadows. An absolute void that seemed to swallow the fading light. No one was visible in the doorway. Just darkness, and that creaking sound continuing its slow, deliberate progress. Run, Liam hissed, his voice tight with fear. Just run. And we did. We didn't need to be told twice. Adrenaline surged through me, propelling me forward. We plunged back into the undergrowth. Crashing through ferns and scrambling over fallen logs, the image of that slowly opening door burned into my mind. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it, a sense of pursuit, a silent presence at our heels. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs ached, until the trees began to thin and the familiar markers of the Lost Creek Trail reappeared. We didn't stop until we stumbled back onto the main path, collapsing on a mossy log, gasping for breath, our hearts hammering in our chests. It was Sarah who finally spoke, her voice trembling. What was that? I don't know, Liam said, shaking his head, still breathing heavily. I honestly don't know. Emily was silent, her Emily usual bravado replaced by a wide-eyed, unnerved expression. Even she, it seemed, had been shaken to her core. We sat there for a long time, catching our breath, trying to rationalize what we had seen, what we had felt. But there was no rational explanation for a door opening itself in an abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere. No explanation for the oppressive silence, the acrid smell, the feeling of being watched. As darkness deepened, we reluctantly set up camp, choosing a spot as close to the main trail as possible, a pathetic attempt at clinging to safety and civilization. We built a roaring fire, fueled by nervous energy and a desperate need for light and warmth. We ate trail food in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The image of the cabin and its slowly opening door casting a long shadow over our evening. Sleep was fitful and uneasy. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept imagining that door opening wider and wider, the darkness within spilling out into the woods, reaching for us. I drifted in and out of consciousness, plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and acrid smoke. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in pale streaks of gray and pink, we were all exhausted and on edge. We broke camp quickly, packing our gear with a grim efficiency, eager to leave this place behind. There was no talk of hidden waterfalls or ghost stories now. Our only goal was to get back to the trailhead, back to the parking lot, back to our car, and back to the world we understood. We hiked in silence, moving at a brisk pace, our eyes constantly scanning the woods around us. The forest, which had seemed so captivating just yesterday, now felt menacing, watchful. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps approaching. It was mid-morning when we reached the clearing with the cabin again. We hadn't planned to come back, hadn't even discussed it, but somehow we had found ourselves drawn back to that place, compelled by a morbid curiosity that was stronger than our fear. The cabin stood silent and still in the morning light. The smoke was gone. The door was closed, or at least closed as much as its sagging hinges would allow. It looked ordinary. Dilapidated, yes, but ordinary. In the daylight, stripped of the twilight shadows and the rising smoke, it seemed almost harmless. "See," Emily said, her voice regaining a hint of its usual confidence. "It's just an old cabin. We were probably just imagining things last night. Shadows playing tricks on us." Liam and Sarah exchanged skeptical glances, but even they seemed to relax slightly in the face of the mundane reality of the daylight. Maybe it had been just our imaginations, fueled by fatigue and the spooky atmosphere of the woods. Maybe the smoke had been from some animal nest, catching fire somehow. Maybe the door had just been the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were wrong. That something had happened there. Something real, something unnatural. And as I looked at the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't seen in the fading light of yesterday evening. Carved into the wooden door, just below the level of the latch, was a symbol. It was small, almost hidden, etched into the weathered wood with a sharp blade. It was a circle, with 3 lines radiating outwards, like spokes on a wheel or claw marks. It was crude, unsettlingly primal, and undeniably deliberate. I pointed it out to the others. They gathered around, peering at the carving, their earlier attempts at reassurance fading away. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, tracing the lines with a trembling finger. "I don't know," Lem said, his voice low. "But I don't like it." Emily, however, stepped closer to the cabin, her initial fear replaced by a renewed, almost reckless curiosity. "Maybe it's a clue," she exclaimed. "Maybe it's a symbol, like a sign for something." Before Liam or Sarah could stop her, she reached out and pushed the door open. It swung inwards with a groan, revealing the interior of the cabin. Darkness still filled the doorway, but as our eyes adjusted, we began to make out details. A single room, small and cramped. A rough-hewn table in the center, littered with things. Jars, bottles, strange implements made of bone and metal. And in the corner, a fireplace, cold and empty now, but still bearing the faint scent of wood smoke and that acrid, chemical undertone. And then we saw what was on the walls. Not wallpaper, not paintings, but drawings. Scratched directly into the logs, crude figures, grotesque shapes rendered in charcoal or soot. They were disturbing, unsettlingly organic, like twisted trees or deformed animals, but also humanoid. Distorted, elongated figures with limbs too long, faces too gaunt. Eyes that seemed to stare out from the wood itself. And everywhere interspersed among the drawings were those symbols. Circles with radiating lines. Hundreds of them carved, scratched. Burned into the wood, covering every inch of the walls, the table, even the floorboards. We stood there, frozen in the doorway, staring into the heart of the cabin at the grotesque art. The unsettling symbols, the lingering scent of smoke and something else, something wrong. The morning sunlight seemed to dim, the forest to fall silent once more. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever, not just from outside, but from within the cabin itself, from the drawings on the walls, from the very wood of the structure. And then, from the depths of the cabin, from the darkness beyond the doorway, we heard it. A sound, not a creak, not a rustle, but a sigh. A long, slow, drawn-out sigh, like a breath exhaled after a long sleep, or a long wait. And we knew with a chilling certainty that went beyond fear, beyond reason, that we were not alone in the woods. And that whatever was in that cabin, whatever had made that smoke, whatever had carved those symbols was no awake. And it knew we were there. My name is Jake, and I've always been the designated planner in our group of friends. Not because I'm some kind of control freak, but because if I didn't, we'd probably end up eating gas station sushi for every meal or sleeping in a ditch somewhere. So, when Mark, ever the adrenaline junkie, suggested a hiking trip to kick off the spring break, everyone naturally looked at me. "Dude, we gotta hit up Eagle Creek," Mark had said, eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of reckless enthusiasm. "I heard it's got some killer trails, man. Real wilderness stuff, Eagle Creek. I'd vaguely heard of it. It sounded rustic. And by killer trails, you mean? I'd asked, already bracing myself. Like untouched, bro, off the grid. The kind of place where you can actually get lost, you know. Adventure. I exchanged a look with Sarah, my girlfriend, who rolled her eyes but also had a small, intrigued smile playing on her lips. Sarah was always up for anything outdoorsy, though she usually preferred things a little more civilized. Then there was Chris, our resident skeptic and tech head, who was already pulling out his phone. "Let's see Eagle Creek Trail," Chris muttered, tapping away. "Looks like it's supposed to be pretty well marked. Moderate difficulty. Lots of good reviews online. Reviews. Schmeviews." Mark scoffed. "That's for the tourists, man. I'm talking about going deeper. Finding the real Eagle Creek." And that's how we end up staring at a grainy, slightly outdated map I'd managed to print out from some obscure hiking website. It was supposedly a map of the Eagle Creek Trail system, but it looked more like someone had sneezed green ink onto a piece of parchment. The trails were a tangled mess of dotted lines, some labeled with names that sounded vaguely official, others just faded lines disappearing into the green abyss. "See," Mark said, jabbing a finger at the map. "Look at all this uncharted territory. We can blaze our own trail, man. Be pioneers." I squinted at the map, trying to decipher the spaghetti of lines. "Mark, this looks less like a trail map and more like abstract art." Details. Mark waved dismissively. "The point is, it's wilderness. We'll be fine. We've got each other, right?" He clapped me on the shoulder, his usual brand of overly confident reassurance. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, piped up. "We should probably at least try to stick to a marked trail, especially since we're not exactly seasoned survivalists stuff." "Come on, Sarah, where's your sense of adventure?" Mark teased. "I'll have a little. Besides," he lowered his voice conspiratorially, "I heard there are some old logging trails that branch off the main path. Those are the ones we want to find. That's where the real Eagle Creek experience is." Chris, still glued to his phone, finally looked up, a frown creasing his forehead. "Actually," he said slowly, "I'm getting some weird vibes about this place online. Some of the older reviews, they mention people getting lost, like really lost. And there are a few unsettling stories." Unsettling stories. Mark's eyes widened again, but this time with a different kind of gleam. "Dude, even better. Sounds like Eagle Creek might have some secrets." I sighed. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of. Mark's idea of adventure usually involved a healthy dose of questionable decision-making. But Sarah was looking intrigued, and even Chris, despite his skepticism, seemed a little bit hooked by the unsettling stories angle. And honestly, a part of me was curious too. We'd been cooped up in our college town for months, buried under textbooks and ramen noodles. A little wilderness, even if it was slightly sketchy, sounded appealing. "Okay, fine," I conceded, holding up the ridiculous map. "But we stick together, and we try to at least loosely follow one of these lines. And if it starts to feel too uncharted, we turn back." "Deal. Deal," Mark whooped, grabbing the map from my hand and folding it with unnecessary force. "Adventure awaits, my friends. Let's do this." So, the next morning, armed with backpacks, hiking boots, and a questionable map, we set off for Eagle Creek. The drive there was longer than expected, the paved roads eventually giving way to bumpy gravel tracks that wound deeper and deeper into the woods. By the time we reached the trailhead, marked by a small, weathered wooden sign that looked like it had been chewed on by squirrels, the sun was already starting to climb high in the sky. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. The forest canopy was dense, filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed kind of way. Even Chris seemed to relax a little, stowing his phone in his backpack and actually looking around. The first part of the hike was exactly as advertised, a well-maintained trail, clearly marked with faded blue blazes on the trees. We chatted, joked around, and generally enjoyed the fresh air and the scenery. The trail wound gently uphill, following a small, gurgling stream. Sunlight peeked through the leaves, illuminating patches of moss and wildflowers. It was peaceful, almost idyllic. But after about an hour, things started to change. The blue blazes became fewer and farther between. The trail, once wide and clear, narrowed and became overgrown with weeds and fallen branches. The forest seemed to grow denser, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the increasingly thick canopy. The air grew cooler, damper, and the sounds of the stream faded away, replaced by a deeper, almost unsettling silence. Guys, Sarah said, stopping and looking around. Are we still on the trail? I pulled out the map, unfolding it carefully. The ink seemed to have bled even more in my backpack, making the already confusing lines even harder to decipher. According to this, we should be on the ridge trail still. It's supposed to loop around and eventually connect back to the main path. Chris consulted his phone again, frowning. No signal, of course. And the GPS is struggling. Says we're off-road. Great. Mark, however, was undeterred. Relax, guys. This is the good stuff. See, we're getting off the beaten path. Just like I said, he pointed ahead, where the trail seemed to fork into two barely visible tracks, both equally overgrown and indistinct. Which way now, O wise navigator? He asked me with a grin. I stared at the fork in the trail, then back at the map. Neither path looked particularly appealing. Neither path looked particularly like a path. The map offered no clues, the faded lines blurring into an incomprehensible mess. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. This was starting to feel less like adventure, and more like getting lost. Okay, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Let's take the left fork. It seems to be heading generally in the direction we want to go, according to this thing. I gestured vaguely at the map. We took the left fork. Or at least what we thought was the left fork. It was less a fork and more of a subtle divergence, a barely perceptible thinning of the undergrowth in one direction. The trail narrowed even further, becoming little more than a faint deer path winding through the trees. The silence deepened, pressing in on us from all sides. The air grew heavy, still, and the forest seemed to watch us with a silent, unseen gaze. After another half hour of increasingly difficult hiking, scrambling over fallen logs, and pushing through thickets of thorny bushes, even Mark's enthusiasm started to wane. He was still trying to put on a brave face, but I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. So, Sarah said again, her voice a little strained this time. Are we sure this is still a trail? I stopped again, pulling out the map for what felt like the 100th time. I stared at it, rotating it this way and that, trying to make sense of the meaningless lines. It was useless. The map was worthless. We were officially undeniably lost. Okay, I admitted, finally given voice to the fear that had been growing in all of us. Okay, we're not on the trail anymore. I don't know where we are. A heavy silence descended. Even Mark was quiet now, his usual bravado replaced by a pale, slightly panicked expression. Chris just shook his head, muttering something about, "I told you so," under his breath. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves in the unseen wind, and the frantic beating of my own heart. We were alone, lost, and deep in the woods. And somehow I had the unsettling feeling that we weren't just lost in the woods. We were lost in something else entirely, something darker. And then I heard it, a sound that made the blood run cold in my veins. A low, dragging sound coming from deeper in the woods, somewhere ahead of us on the barely there trail. It was a sound like something heavy being pulled through the undergrowth. Something unwilling. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I looked at Sarah, at Mark, at Chris. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a dawning, shared terror. They had heard it too, that dragging sound. And in that moment, we all knew with a chilling certainty that we were no longer just hiking, we were being dragged, deeper and deeper into the woods. And something was waiting for us there. The dragging sound, it was faint at first, almost swallowed by the rustling leaves and the pounding in my ears. But it was there, undeniably there. A low, scraping, rhythmic drag that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the woods. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too heavy, too deliberate, too unnatural. We stood frozen, listening, the silence of the forest amplifying the dread that coiled in our stomachs. The sound came again, closer this time, clearer. Scrape, drag, it was like something immense and unwilling was being pulled through the undergrowth, tearing leaves and snapping twigs in its wake. What is that? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the dark depths of the woods ahead. Mark, who usually had an explanation for everything, just shook his head, his face ashen. Even his bravado had been completely extinguished by that sound. Chris, ever the pragmatist, was the first to break the paralysis. Okay, don't panic, he said, though his voice trembled slightly. It's probably just an animal, a deer maybe, dragging a branch. His explanation sounded flimsy even to his own ears. We all knew it wasn't a deer. Deer don't make that kind of sound. Deer don't inspire this kind of primal fear. Let's just go. I stammered, my voice cracking. Let's turn around. Now. Turning back seemed like the only logical option, the only sane thing to do. But as I turned to retrace our steps, I realized something else, something even more terrifying. The trail behind us, the faint deer path we'd been following, was gone. It wasn't just overgrown. It was as if it had never been there at all. The undergrowth was thick and unbroken, a seamless tapestry of ferns and bushes and tangled vines. There was no hint of a path, no trace of where we had come from. It was like the woods had swallowed our trail whole, erasing our passage as if we were never meant to return. "Guz," I said, my voice barely a croak. I gestured behind us at the impenetrable wall of green. The trail, it's gone. Sarah turned, her eyes widening in disbelief. She took a step back, then another, searching for any sign of the path, any break in the dense vegetation. There was nothing, only the unbroken, indifferent forest. No, that's not possible," she whispered, her voice laced with panic. We just came from there, right there." Mark spun around, frantically searching, his eyes darting from side to side. "Where did it go? What the hell is going on?" Chris just stared, his face a mask of stunned horror. He didn't say anything, but his silence was more terrifying than any words. He understood, I think, even before the rest of us did, the true depth of our predicament. We were lost, truly lost. Not just geographically, but in some deeper, more fundamental way. The woods weren't just disorienting us. They were actively changing around us, erasing our path, leading us deeper. And the dragging sound was getting closer. Scrapey drag, scrape, drag, it was no longer faint. It was loud now, insistent, echoing through the silent woods. It was coming from directly ahead, blocking our path forward, and there was no path behind us to retreat to. We were trapped, caught between the unknown horror ahead and the vanished path behind. "Okay, think, Jake, think," I muttered to myself, trying to force down the rising tide of panic. "There has to be something, another way. We can't just stand here." I pulled out the useless map again, staring at the tangled lines as if they might suddenly rearrange themselves into something coherent. Of course they didn't. The map remained a mocking, indecipherable mess. But as I stared at it, something caught my eye. A faint, almost invisible line, barely distinguishable from the surrounding green ink, that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't labeled, it wasn't marked in any way, but it seemed to branch off from the ridge trail and head deeper, into the blank, uncharted space in the center of the map. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only thing the map offered, the only possible direction that wasn't blocked by the dragging sound or erased by the forest. "Maybe," I said slowly, pointing at the faint line on the map. "Maybe there's another trail. A really old one. It's not marked, but maybe it's still there. Maybe it goes around." Mark and Sarah looked at the map, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Chris just remained silent, his eyes still wide with that unnerving, knowing horror. "Around what?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Around what's making that sound." I didn't have an answer to that. I didn't want to think about what was making that sound. But the alternative, standing there trapped, waiting for whatever was dragging itself through the woods to reach us, was unthinkable. "We don't have a choice," I said, my voice firmer now, trying to project an authority I didn't feel. "We have to try. It's either this, or we just wait for that thing." I gestured vaguely in the direction of the dragging sound. Mark and Sarah nodded, their faces grim. Even Chris, after a moment of hesitation, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Desperate times, desperate measures. We were out of options. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "We go that way. We stick together. And we move quietly. Maybe if we're quiet, whatever that is won't notice us. It was a foolish hope, I knew, but it was all we had. We turned and started to move in the direction of the faint line on the map, away from the dragging sound, deeper into the uncharted heart of Eagle Creek. The forest changed again, subtly but undeniably. The trees grew taller, their trunks thicker and gnarled, their branches intertwining overhead to form an almost complete canopy, blotting out what little sunlight had managed to penetrate before. The undergrowth thinned out, replaced by a carpet of damp, decaying leaves that muffled our footsteps, making the silence even more profound. The air grew colder, heavier, and it felt wrong, like we had crossed some invisible boundary, stepped into a place that wasn't meant for us. The dragging sound receded behind us, becoming fainter and fainter as we moved deeper. But the silence that replaced it was, in its own way, even more unsettling. It was a silence that felt alive, a silence that seemed to listen, to watch, to wait. We walked for what felt like hours, stumbling through the deepening gloom, our senses strained, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sending jolts of fear through our bodies. We didn't talk, didn't dare to break the oppressive silence. We just walked, blindly following the faint, imaginary line on the map, hoping against hope that it would lead us somewhere, anywhere, away from this nightmare. And then, just when we thought we couldn't take it anymore, when our legs were atching and our throats were parched and our minds were teetering on the edge of despair, we saw it. Ahead, through the trees, a break in the darkness, a faint pale light. Hope surged through me, a desperate, exhilarating rush. Light. It meant civilization, maybe. Okay, possibly, it had to be. We stumbled forward, our pace quickening, our hearts pounding with renewed hope. But as we got closer, as the light grew stronger, I realized something was wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. It wasn't sunlight. It was too pale, too cold, too unnatural. And it wasn't coming from above, from the sky. It was coming from the ground. We pushed through the last of the trees and stepped into a small clearing. And in the center of the clearing, bathed in an eerie, phosphorescent glow, was a hole. Not a natural hole, not a sinkhole or burrow. This was something else. A perfectly circular pit, as if bored into the earth by some immense, unseen drill. The edges were smooth, unnaturally smooth, and the air around it shimmered with a faint, cold light. And from the depths of the hole, that pale, unearthly glow emanated, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. We stood at the edge of the pit, staring down into the glowing abyss, our hope turning to a new, even deeper kind of terror. This wasn't escape. This wasn't civilization. This was something else entirely. This was the source of the dragging sound, the source of the unnatural silence, the source of the fear that had been growing in us since we first stepped off the marked trail. And as we stared into that glowing hole, into the darkness that pulsed with an unholy light, we heard the dragging sound again. But this time it wasn't coming from ahead of us. It was coming from below, from the depths of the pit, and it was getting closer, closer and closer, dragging itself up from the darkness towards us, towards the light, towards its prey, the hole. It wasn't just a hole. It was an abyss, a wound in the earth that pulsed with a sickly, phosphorescent light. The light wasn't warm or inviting, it was cold, sterile, like the glow of decay. It illuminated the clearing in an unsettling way, casting long, skeletal shadows from the trees, making them look like grasping claws reaching out for us. The air around the hole shimmered, distorting the already unnatural light, making it seem to writhe and undulate like something alive. The edges of the pit were too perfect, too smooth. It was as if a giant cookie cutter had been pressed into the earth, leaving behind this perfectly circular void. There was no loose soil, no crumbling edges, just a clean, sharp drop into the unknown. The smell was indescribable. Not exactly sulfurous, not exactly rotten, but something acrid and metallic, with an undertone of something else, something organic and deeply, profoundly wrong. It was a smell that seemed to claw at the back of your throat, a smell of violation and corruption. And from the depths of this unnatural pit, the dragging sound intensified. Scrape, drag, it was closer now, much closer, resonating up from the darkness, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, a promise of something terrible rising from below. Sarah gasped, stumbling back from the edge of the hole, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark stood frozen, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the glowing abyss. Chris, who had been silent and withdrawn since we lost the trail, finally spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper. "No, no, no," he repeated, shaking his head frantically. This isn't real. This can't be real." But his eyes, wide with terror, betrayed his words. He knew, as we all did, that this was horrifyingly, undeniably real. The dragging sound grew louder, faster, more frantic. Scrape, drag, scrape, drag, scrape, drag. It was rising quickly now, whatever it was, clawing its way up from the depths. The pale light in the hole pulsed in time with the sound, as if the pit itself was breathing, exhaling this unholy presence into our world. "We have to go," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear, but urgency overriding the panic. "No, run." I didn't know where to run to. There was no trail, no path back, just the oppressive forest surrounding the clearing. But any direction, any movement, was better than standing there, waiting for whatever was climbing out of that hole. I grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her away from the edge of the pit. Mark, jolted from his trance, finally moved, stumbling after us. Chris, however, remained rooted to the spot, staring into the glowing abyss, as if hypnotized by the horror rising from below. "Chris, come on," I yelled, pulling Sarah along, glancing back at Chris, willing him to move. He didn't. He just stood there, transfixed, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he could see something in that hole that we couldn't, something that held him captive. And then it emerged. Not suddenly, not with a jump or a lunge, but slowly, agonizingly slowly, as if it was being dragged against its will, pulled into our world inch by agonizing inch. The dragging sound reached a crescendo, a deafening SCRPDRH, and then something solid broke the surface of the glowing light. It was formless at first, a shifting, amorphous mass of darkness that seemed to absorb the pale light around it, leaving only a deeper, hungrier shadow. It was slick, glistening, and it moved with a sickening, unnatural fluidity, like oil spreading across water, or something internal being forced outwards. As it rose further, vague shapes began to coalesce within the darkness. Long, trailing limbs, too many limbs, dragging and scraping against the edges of the pit as it pulled itself free. Glimpses of pallid, glistening flesh stretched taut over something angular and wrong. And then a shape, a suggestion of a head, or perhaps just a concentration of darkness at the top of the mass, where 2 points of malevolent, red light flickered into existence like embers in the gloom. It wasn't any creature I could name, any animal I could recognize. It was something other. Something alien, something that violated the natural order, something that should not exist. It was a nightmare made flesh, a thing born from the deepest, darkest recesses of the earth, or perhaps from somewhere even further beyond. The smell intensified, becoming almost unbearable, a cloying stench of decay and something else, something hungry. The air around the entity seemed to warp and distort, the trees behind it blurring and wavering as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling in its presence. Chris finally screamed. A raw, animalistic sound of pure, unadulterated terror. It broke the spell that had held him captive. He stumbled back, away from the hole, away from the thing that was now fully emerged. Standing, or rather, towering in the center of the clearing. It was huge, impossibly huge, taller than the trees, its amorphous form stretching and shifting, its red eyes burning down on us with cold, predatory hunger. The dragging limbs, now fully visible, were not limbs at all, but more like tendrils, thick and corded, tipped with wickedly sharp, chitinous claws that scraped against the earth, leaving deep gouges in the soil. It didn't move towards us immediately. It just stood there, looming, its red eyes scanning us, assessing us, as if deciding which of us to devour first. The silence returned, heavier than ever, broken only by Chris's rag sobs and our own frantic, shallow breaths. Then it moved. Not with a run or a charge, but a slow, deliberate glide, its tendrils sliding across the ground, pulling its immense bulk forward. The ground trembled beneath its weight. The trees seemed to recoil, their leaves rustling in a silent scream. It was coming for us. There was no doubt, no escape. We were trapped in the clearing, caught between the glowing abyss and the monstrous entity that had crawled out of it. The path behind us was gone. The forest around us was silent and hostile. And ahead of us was only the thing from the hole. Mark, finally snapping out of his catatonia, grabbed Sarah's other hand, pulling her in the opposite direction of the approaching entity. "Run!" He screamed, his voice hoarse with terror. "Run. Just run. We ran. We didn't know where we were running to, didn't care. We just ran blindly, desperately. Crashing through the undergrowth, stumbling over roots and fallen logs. The image of that monstrous entity burned into our minds, the stench of it filling our nostrils, the scraping of its tendrils echoing in our ears. We ran until our lungs burned, our legs ached, our hearts hammered against our ribs like trapped birds. We ran until we could run no more, collapsing in a heap at the base of a giant, gnarled tree, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and terror. We didn't dare to look back. We didn't dare to speak. We just huddled together, listening, waiting, praying that whatever was chasing us had given up, had lost our trail, had returned to its hole in the earth. But the silence of the forest offered no comfort. It was still there, that oppressive, watchful silence. And after a long, agonizing moment, we heard it again. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Scrape, drag, it was still coming us. And it was getting closer. We were still lost. Still trapped. Still being dragged deeper into the woods. And now, we knew what was dragging us. It wasn't the woods themselves. It was something in the woods. Something from the hole. Something hungry. And as the dragging sound grew louder, closer, I closed my eyes and waited for it to find us. Because in that moment, deep in the heart of Eagle Creek, lost and hunted and utterly alone, I knew that there was no escape. We had made bad decisions. We had ignored the warnings. We had gone off the map. And now, the map was the least of our worries. Now, we were prey. And the woods, and whatever lurked within them, were the hunters. And the hunt was almost over. My name is Alex, and I've always been drawn to the wild. Not the manicured wilderness of national parks, teeming with RVs and selfie sticks, but the real, untamed places. The kind where the trees are older than your country, and the silence is so profound it hums in your ears. I'm talking about the deep woods, the high peaks. The places where you're not just visiting nature, you're stepping into something ancient and indifferent. That's why I found myself standing at the trailhead of the Blackwood Mountain Trail on a crisp morning in late September. The air had that bite of early fall, promising colder days ahead, and the leaves were just starting to turn, painting the lower slopes in streaks of gold and crimson. It was beautiful, no doubt about it. The kind of beauty that catches in your throat and makes you feel small in the face of something immense. But even in that beauty, there was an edge, a whisper of something else. Blackwood Mountain wasn't exactly a popular destination. It was tucked away in a less visited corner of the Appalachians, known more for its challenging climbs and unpredictable weather than scenic overlooks or Instagrammable moments. Most hikers stuck to the more accessible trails, the ones with visitor centers and clearly marked paths. Blackwood was for the serious types, the ones who wanted to test themselves, to push their limits. And maybe, if I was honest with myself, that was exactly what I was looking for. Life had been complicated lately. Work was a grind, relationships were strained, and the general hum of modern existence felt like it was slowly suffocating me. I needed to unplug, to disconnect, to find that sense of clarity that only comes when you strip away all the noise and distractions and are left with just yourself and the raw elements. Hiking, especially solo hiking in places like Blackwood, had always been my reset button. It was where I could sort through my thoughts, face my anxieties, and come out feeling well, if not exactly renewed, then at least less frayed around the edges. This trip was to be a 3-day, 2-night trek. Ambitious maybe for Blackwood, but I'd done longer and tougher hikes before. I'd meticulously planned my route, studied the topo maps, checked the weather forecasts, a clear skies predicted for the entire duration, thankfully, and packed my gear with the precision of a seasoned backpacker. Tent, sleeping bag rated for sub-freezing temperatures, first aid kit, water filter, compass, fire starter, the whole 9 yards. I even splurged on a new lightweight stove and a fancy dehydrated meal kit. I wasn't exactly roughing it, but I wasn't glamping either. Just prepared. And speaking of prepared, that brings me to the food. Now, I'm not usually one to overpack. I'm all about efficiency and minimizing weight, especially on longer hikes. But for this trip, something felt different. Maybe it was the stories I'd read about Blackwood, the whispers of hikers getting lost, running into trouble, the mountain having a way of keeping people. Superstition, probably. But still, That little seed of unease had taken root in my mind. So, I packed extra food just in case. Not just the usual energy bars and trail mix, but actual meals. Extra dehydrated pouches of chili, beef stew, even a couple of those foil packs of tuna. It added weight to my pack, sure, but in my mind it was a small price to pay for peace of mind. Better safe than sorry, right? That was my mantra as I hefted my pack onto my shoulders at the trailhead. The ranger station was deserted, just a small wooden cabin with a map posted outside. I traced my intended route with my finger doubled, checking the landmarks and elevation gains. Everything looked straightforward enough. The trailhead marker itself was a weathered wooden post, almost swallowed by the encroaching forest. Blackwood Mountain Trail. It read, the letters faded and worn. Beneath it, in smaller script, was a warning. Experienced hikers only. Trail conditions may be hazardous. Proceed at your own risk. A shiver traced its way down my spine, despite the sunshine filtering through the trees. Hazardous trail conditions. That was putting it mildly, judging by the overgrown state of the trail right from the start. Vines snaked across the path, roots jutted out like gnarled fingers, and the undergrowth was thick and tangled. This wasn't a stroll in the park. This was a fight. But that was part of the appeal, wasn't it? The challenge, the solitude, the feeling of truly being out there, away from everything and everyone. I took a deep breath of the crisp pine, scented air, adjusted my pack straps one last time, and stepped onto the trail. The first few hours were exactly what I'd hoped for. The trail climbed steadily, but not brutally, through a forest that was slowly transitioning into its autumn colors. Sunlight dappled through the canopy, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the fallen leaves, the rustle of wind in the branches, and the occasional call of a bird hidden deep within the woods. I fell into the rhythm of hiking, the steady pace, the focused breathing, the quiet contemplation. My thoughts, initially a jumbled mess of work deadlines and relationship woes, began to unravel and sort themselves out. The physical exertion, the immersion in nature, it was already working its magic. By midday, I'd reached a small stream, gurgling over moss-covered stones. I stopped for lunch, pulling out one of my extra food pouches, the chili, and heating it up on my stove. It tasted surprisingly good. Sitting there by the stream, the forest silent around me. As the afternoon wore on, the trail started to climb more steeply. The trees grew taller, denser, blocking out more of the sunlight. The air became cooler, damper. The forest floor changed too, the colorful leaves giving way to a carpet of pine needles and damp earth. The beauty was still there, but it was a different kind of beauty now, a more somber, brooding kind. The whispers of unease from the trailhead started to grow a little louder in my mind. I pressed on, determined to reach my planned campsite before nightfall. According to the map, it was a small clearing near a spring, about another 2 hours of hiking. The trail became less distinct, more overgrown, and I had to pay closer attention to my map and compass to stay on course. The feeling of solitude deepened, but it was starting to feel less like peaceful solitude and more like isolation. The light was fading faster now, the shadows lengthening and stretching into distorted shapes. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming like silent watchers. The wind picked up, sighing through the branches with a sound that was almost like a moan. And then I noticed it. A smell. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible, just a subtle undertone to the earthy scent of the forest. But as I continued to hike, it grew stronger, more distinct. A sickly sweet, cloying odor, like something rotting. I wrinkled my nose, trying to identify it. Decaying leaves, animal carcass. It was hard to tell, but it was definitely unpleasant, definitely unsettling. I glanced around, my senses on high alert. The forest was silent except for the wind, but the smell was definitely there, clinging to the air, growing stronger with each step. And then I felt it. My pack, it felt heavier. Significantly heavier than it had been just a few hours ago. I stopped, lowering my pack to the ground with a grunt. It landed with a dull thud, heavier than it should have been, even with the extra food I'd packed. I frowned, unbuckling the straps and opening the main compartment. Everything seemed to be in order. Tent, sleeping bag, stove. First aid kit all accounted for. I rummaged through the side pockets, checking my water bottles, my snacks, my map and compass. Nothing seemed out of place, but the weight was undeniable. And that smell, it was definitely coming from my pack. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the main compartment again. What was it? What could be making my pack so heavy and emitting that awful, rotten smell? I told myself it was just my imagination, the fatigue, the growing unease of the darkening forest playing tricks on my senses. But deep down, a cold knot of dread was tightening in my stomach. Taking a deep breath, I reached into my pack again, pushing aside my sleeping bag, intent to get to the bottom. And that's when I saw it, or rather, smelled it fully. The source of the rot. It wasn't something in my pack. It was part of it. Something had changed. Something was horribly, inexplicably wrong with the very fabric of my backpack. And the weight, oh God, the weight, I didn't understand it. Couldn't comprehend it. But as I stared into the depths of my pack, at the growing darkness within, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that my hike on Blackwood Mountain had just taken a very, very wrong turn. And the extra food I'd packed, just in case, it suddenly felt like the least of my worries. In fact, it felt like it might be exactly what had drawn it to me in the first place. My head swam. Rotting smell. Impossible weight. It had to be exhaustion, altitude sickness, something logical. But logic felt thin and brittle out here, swallowed by the deepening shadows and the oppressive silence of the woods. I scrambled back from my pack, heart hammering against my ribs, and stared at it as if it were a venomous snake coiled at my feet. The smell was overpowering now, thick and cloying. It wasn't just like rot anymore. It was organic, like spoiled meat, but with an undertone of something else, something vaguely sweet and disturbingly familiar, yet utterly alien. And the weight that it was pressing into the earth, the pack straps digging into the fallen leaves, leaving deep impressions. This wasn't just a heavy pack. This was something else. Slowly, cautiously, I circled it. It looked normal enough from the outside. My trusty Osprey pack, the one I'd taken on countless hikes, the one I knew like the back of my hand. But something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. It was like looking at a familiar face in a distorted mirror, recognizing the features, but knowing instinctively that something vital had been twisted, corrupted. I forced myself to approach again, inching closer, my hand outstretched hesitantly. The fabric felt different. Not the tough water-resistant nylon I knew. This was softer, almost fleshy. A cold dread washed over me, a primal fear that whispered of violations of the natural order unraveling. I recoiled again, my breath catching in my throat. Okay, Alex, think, I muttered, my voice sounding weak and reedy in the vastness of the forest. Just think. Maybe something had gotten into my pack. A dead animal. But the weight and the smell and the way the fabric felt, no. That didn't make sense. This was something else. Something far more disturbing. I needed to get away from it. Needed to put distance between myself and that. But I couldn't just leave my pack. Everything I needed to survive was in there. Tent, sleeping bag, water filter. First aid abandoning it meant abandoning any hope of making it out of Blackwood Mountain. And something deep inside me, a survival instinct honed by years of wilderness treks, screamed that running was not an option. Facing it, whatever it was the only way. Taking another shaky breath, I reached for the pack again, this time with more resolve. I had to see what was going on, had to understand. Maybe, just maybe, there was a rational explanation. Maybe I was hallucinating, sleep-deprived, dehydrated, and this was all some elaborate trick of my mind. Hope, however flimsy, was better than blind panic. I unbuckled the main compartment again, forcing myself to look inside. Darkness. Just darkness. Deeper than it should have been somehow. Like the inside of my pack wasn't just a space, but a void, an absence of light that seemed to suck in the surrounding dusk. And the smell of it intensified, hitting me in a wave, making my stomach churn. I fumbled for my headlamp, my fingers clumsy and numb. Clicking it on, I directed the beam into the pack. The light seemed to falter, to be swallowed by that unnatural darkness. But then it caught on something. Something wrong. My carefully packed gear was still there, or at least, shapes that vaguely resembled my gear. But they were changed. My sleeping bag, once a vibrant blue, was now a dull, sickly gray, and it seemed to pulse faintly like something breathing. My tent, neatly folded in its stuffed sack, looked bloated and distended, its fabric stretched taut, straining at the seams. And my food pouches, oh God, my food pouches. They were no longer neatly sealed packages of dehydrated meals. They were swollen, grotesquely inflated, bulging with something that moved and read beneath the foil. The labels were still there, faded and distorted. But the images, the cheerful pictures of steaming chili and hearty stew, they seemed to mock me now, to twist into something obscene and horrifying. And then I saw it. Nestled amongst the corrupted jeer, partially hidden by the pulsating sleeping bag, was something else. Something that definitely hadn't been there when I packed. Something organic, round, smooth, and a sickly, pale white like bone bleached by the sun. But it wasn't bone, it was softer. And it pulsed too in a slow, rhythmic beat that seemed to echo the throbbing in my own temples. I reached out, drawn by a morbid curiosity I couldn't resist, my fingers trembling as they approached the pale, pulsing thing. It was cool to the touch, strangely smooth and yielding, like touching flesh, rotten flesh. The smell intensified as I got closer, almost unbearable now, making my eyes water and my gorge rise. And then it moved. Not just pulsed, but actually moved. A slow, deliberate shift, a subtle undulation of its pale surface. And a thin black line appeared on its surface, a crack, a fissure widening slowly, revealing something inside. I recoiled, stumbling back, gagging, bile rising in my throat. I knew instinctively that I didn't want to see what was inside that thing. Didn't want to know. But the fissure continued to widen, and a faint, sickly light began to emanate from within, casting grotesque shadows on the surrounding trees. And then the smell changed again. The rot was still there, but now it was overlaid with something else. Something sharper, more acrid, like acid. And a faint hissing sound began to emanate from the pack, a sound like escaping steam, or something being eaten away. Panic seized me, a cold, paralyzing wave. I had to get rid of it. Had to unburden myself of this abomination. I fumbled for the pack straps, desperate to rip it off, to throw it as far away from me as possible. But the straps were stuck, fused to the fabric of the pack somehow. They wouldn't budge. I tugged harder, yanking and pulling, my fingers scrabbling at the strange, fleshy material. The straps held fast, as if they were rooted to my shoulders, as if the pack had become part of me. And the hissing sound grew louder, closer, and I could feel a faint warmth radiating from the pack, spreading through my back, burning like a fever. Desperation lent me strength. I roared, a primal scream of fear and rage, and threw myself to the ground, twisting and writhing, trying to wrench the pack free. I rolled over and over, slamming against rocks and tree roots, tearing at the straps, clawing at the fabric, anything to get it off. Finally, with a sickening tearing sound, one strap ripped free. Then another. And then, with a final agonizing wrench, the pack came loose, tumbling away from me, landing heavily on the forest floor. I scrambled back, gasping for breath, my shoulders burning, my hands raw and bleeding. I stared at the pack lying there in the fading light, still hissing, still emitting that sickly sweet, rotting smell. It was smaller now, deflated, somehow like it had expelled something. And then I saw it. On the ground near the pack, where it had landed, was a trail. Not a trail of gear, not a trail of debris, a trail of slime. A thick, viscous, black slime glistening in the faint light, leading away from the pack into the deepening darkness of the woods. And as I watched, paralyzed by fear, the slime trail began to move, to writhe and pulse like a living thing, slithering away into the shadows, leaving me alone in the silence with the stench of rot and the chilling certainty that I had just unburdened myself of something far more terrible than I could ever have imagined, and that it was now loose in the woods, somewhere out there in the darkness, and it was hungry. The slime trail moved. It wasn't just my imagination, exhaustion playing tricks in the fading light. It pulsed, rippled, a black vein snaking across the forest floor, disappearing into the impenetrable gloom beyond the reach of my headlamp. It was alive, or something like alive, and it was leaving me, but where was it going, and what was it? My mind raced, trying to catch up with the impossible horror unfolding around me. The packet had been corrupted, infected, somehow transformed into a living incubator for whatever that slime was. And I had carried it unknowingly for hours, feeling it grow, feeling it change until it was ready to birth. And now that thing, that spawn of rotten darkness, was slithering away into the woods. I was alone. Stripped bare, not just of my pack, but of any semblance of control, of understanding. The forest, which had initially seemed indifferent, now felt actively hostile, a malevolent presence watching me from the shadows, waiting. The wind sighed through the trees again, and this time it wasn't like a moan. It was a whisper, a hungry whisper. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but something primal, something deep within my survival instinct kicked in. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford, not now, not here. I needed to assess the situation to figure out what to do to survive. Survival. That was the only thought that mattered now. I took stock of what I had left. Headlamp, thankfully still strapped to my forehead. Knife, sheathed on my belt. Compass map, still in my pocket. Water bottles empty. Food gone with the pack. Shelter gone. First aid gone. Everything essential was gone. Stripped bare. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was utterly, terrifyingly unprepared. I had packed extra food, yes, but it had been a lure, a sacrifice, unknowingly offered to whatever dark entity had claimed my pack. And now that offering was gone, and I was left with nothing but the clothes on my back and the growing certainty that I was in deep, deep trouble. My gaze fell back to the slime trail. It was still moving slowly, steadily, disappearing further and further into the woods. A desperate, foolish thought flickered in my mind. Should I follow it? Could I retrieve my pack? Maybe, just maybe, it had only expelled that thing, and the rest of my gear was still intact. Hope, however irrational, clung to me like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was madness. To follow that trail, to pursue whatever had spawned from my pack, was to walk willingly into the jaws of whatever horror lurked in these woods. Instinct screamed at me to run, to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. Run where? I didn't know. Back to the trailhead. It was miles away, hours away in the deepening darkness, with no trail markers, no food, no water. But staying here, staying anywhere near that slime trail felt like a death sentence. Decision made, not blindly. I pulled out my compass, oriented myself, trying to recall the map, the direction of the trailhead. West. West was the way out. I turned west away from the slime trail, away from the lingering stench of rot, and started to run. Not a sprint, not a panicked dash. A steady, desperate jog, pushing myself through the tangled undergrowth, stumbling over roots and rocks, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest whipped past in a blur of shadows and distorted shapes, the trees seeming to lean in, to watch me, to mock my futile flight. The darkness deepened, swallowing the last vestiges of twilight. The headlamp beam cut a narrow swath through the blackness, illuminating only a few feet ahead, turning the surrounding woods into an impenetrable wall of shadow. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent jolts of fear through me, making me jump, making me spin around, expecting to see what? The slime trail. The thing that spawned it. I didn't know. I just knew that I was being hunted, even if I couldn't see my hunter. Hours blurred into an eternity of panicked flight. Fatigue gnawed at me, muscles screaming in protest, lungs burning for air, thirst clawed at my throat, my mouth dry and parched. Hunger, a dull, gnawing ache in my stomach, began to make itself known. But fear was the dominant sensation, a cold, clammy dread that clung to me like a shroud, suffocating any other feeling. I stumbled, fell, picked myself up, and kept running. Driven by adrenaline, by desperation, by the primal urge to survive. I had to get out of these woods. Had to escape Blackwood Mountain. It felt like the mountain itself was alive, sentient, and it didn't want me to leave. It had taken my pack, my supplies, and now it wanted me. And then I heard it. A sound that stopped me dead in my tracks, freezing me to the spot, my blood turning to ice in my veins. Not a rustle of leaves, not a snap of a twig. Something else. A wet, dragging sound slithering through the undergrowth, getting closer. Closer. And with it the smell. The rot. Stronger now, more pungent, almost unbearable. It was following me. The slime. Or whatever was making it hunting me. And it was getting closer. I spun around, headlamp beam frantically searching the darkness behind me. Nothing. Just trees. Shadows. Impenetrable blackness. But the sound was still there, closer now, the wet, dragging slither, and the stench of rot filling my nostrils, choking me. I started to run again, faster this time. A desperate, all-out sprint, pushing myself beyond my limits, adrenaline coursing through my veins. But the sound kept pace, relentless, unwavering, always behind me, always getting closer. It was gaining on me. I couldn't outrun it. Whatever it was faster, stronger, more relentless than I could ever be. And then I saw it. Ahead through the trees, a faint flickering light, not the cold, artificial light of my headlamp, but something warmer, softer. Firelight. Could it be? Could there be someone else out here? Another hiker. A campsite. Hope flared in my chest. A desperate, fragile spark in the overwhelming darkness. Ignoring the burning in my lungs, the screaming in my muscles, I ran towards the light, stumbling, falling, but always getting back up, driven by that desperate hope. The light grew brighter, flickering through the trees, beckoning me forward. And the slithering sound behind me, it seemed to fade, to recede, as if whatever was pursuing me was hesitant to approach the light. I burst through a final thicket of trees and into a small clearing. And there it was. Firelight. A small campfire, flickering merrily in the center of the clearing, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. And beside the fire, a figure. Sitting on a log, hunched over, their back to me, their head bowed. Relief washed over me, so intense it almost made me weak. Salvation. I had found salvation, someone else. Someone who could help me. Someone who could save me from the darkness, from the horror that was hunting me. Hello, I croaked, my voice hoarse and weak, barely a whisper. Help, please help me. The figure didn't move, react. Just sat there, hunched over, motionless beside the flickering fire. Maybe they hadn't heard me, maybe they were asleep. I stumbled forward, into the clearing, towards the fire, towards the figure. My heart pounding with a mixture of relief and trepidation. Hello, I said again, louder this time, my voice cracking. Can you hear me? I need help. Still no response. The figure remained motionless, their backs still to me, their heads still bowed. But as I got closer, as I stepped into the firelight, I saw something else. Something that made my blood run cold. Something that extinguished that fragile spark of hope, replacing it with a terror far more profound, far more chilling than anything I had felt before. The figure wasn't alone. Around the campfire, in the flickering light, were others, dozens of them, sitting, standing, lying on the ground, all motionless, all silent, all pale, and all of them missing something, a limb, an eye, patches of skin as if eaten. And then the figure by the fire moved. Slowly, deliberately, it raised its head and turned to face me, and in the firelight I saw its face, or what was left of it. Pale, gaunt, flesh stretched tight over bone, eye sockets hollow, empty, and a mouth a gaping maw ringed with blackened, decaying flesh stretched impossibly wide, filled with rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth. And from that maw, from that abyss of rotten hunger, came a whisper. Not a moan, not a sigh, but a whisper, carried on the stench of decay, a whisper that chilled me to the very core of my being. Extra food just in case. It whispered, its voice like nails scraping on bone, its empty eye sockets seeming to bore into my soul. Thank you. And then it smiled, a smile that stretched its ruined face even wider, a smile that promised not salvation but consumption. And in that smile, in those empty eyes, I saw the truth. There was no escape from Blackwood Mountain. There was only the hungry dark, and it was waiting, waiting for me, waiting to feed. The crackling fire spat embers into the twilight sky, each tiny spark a fleeting rebellion against the encroaching darkness. Around the makeshift campfire, faces flickered in the orange glow, illuminated with a nervous excitement that only ghost stories in the woods can conjure. There were 5 of us, me, Liam, always the pragmatic one, Maya, whose laughter could usually light up any room, but tonight held a tremor, no, the quiet observer, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames with an unnerving intensity, Chloe. The self-proclaimed skeptic, though her wide eyes betrayed a hidden fascination with the macabre, and myself, Ethan, the designated storyteller, or at least, that's how it usually went. We were nestled deep in the Blackwood Forest, a place whispered about in hushed tones in our small town of Ashton Creek. Locals spun yarns of strange occurrences, disappearances, and an unsettling silence that fell over the woods after dusk. Naturally being the thrill-seeking, slightly foolish teenagers we were, Blackwood was the only place that truly screamed perfect camping spot to us. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The usual daytime chorus of birds had long since faded, replaced by the rustling whispers of unseen things in the undergrowth. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, a silence pregnant with anticipation, making every snap of a twig sound like a footstep, every hoot of an owl like a mournful cry. All right, who's going first? I asked, breaking the comfortable yet tense silence that had settled over us. I poked at the fire with a stick, sending another shower of sparks upwards, momentarily illuminating the circle of faces. Maya shivered dramatically, pulling her oversized hoodie tighter around her. Oh God, can we just skip the scary stories? I'm already freaked out enough just being here. Despite her words, a tiny, excited smile played on her lips. Maya loved being scared, just as long as she could complain about it afterwards. Lime scoffed, rolling his eyes, but a grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. Come on, Maya, what's the point of camping in Blackwood Forest if we're not going to try and scare ourselves silly? Besides, he added, leaning forward conspiratorially, Chloe's dying to tell her totally debunked ghost story again. All eyes turned to Chloe, who flushed a delicate pink under the firelight. It's not debunked, she protested, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. It's unexplained. There's a difference. A Chloe's unexplained story was a local legend about the old abandoned miller's mill on the outskirts of town. Supposedly, the mill was haunted by the spirit of old man Miller himself, who died in a gruesome accident involving the mill machinery. Chloe swore she'd seen lights flickering in the broken windows late one night and heard the faint, rhythmic clang of metal on metal, even though the mill had been derelict for decades. Liam, ever the skeptic, had spent weeks trying to find a logical explanation, attributing it to everything from stray animals to the wind whistling through the dilapidated structure. But even he couldn't fully dismiss the unsettling feeling that clung to the story. Noah, who had been silently watching the flames dance, finally spoke, his voice low and even. I have one, he said, his gaze still fixed on the fire. It's not really a ghost story, more a strange encounter. We all leaned in, instantly captivated. Noah was usually the quietest of our group, preferring to listen rather than contribute. When he did speak, it was always with a thoughtful deliberation that made his words carry more weight. This happened to my uncle. Noah began, his voice barely above a whisper. He was a park ranger, worked in Yosemite for years. He told me this story once, swore it was true. Said he never told anyone else because they'd think he was crazy. The fire crackled, the only sound in the expectant silence. Even Maya seemed to have forgotten her early apprehension, her eyes wide and fixed on Noah. He was patrolling a remote trail late one evening. Noah continued, his voice taking on a slightly more narrative tone. Sun was setting. The forest was getting dark. He heard something moving in the trees off the trail. At first, he thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But then he heard it again, and it sounded wrong. Like something heavy, dragging itself through the undergrowth. He paused, letting the image sink in. The fire popped again, and a log shifted with a loud groan, making us all jump slightly. Chloe let out a nervous giggle. He stopped, drew his flashlight, and shined it into the trees. Noah went on. Nothing, just shadows and leaves. But he could still hear it, this dragging sound, getting closer. He called out, asked if anyone was there. No answer, just the dragging sound. Noah's voice dropped even lower, almost a murmur. He started to feel uneasy, like he was being watched. He turned to go back to the trail, and that's when he saw it. He paused again, drawing out the suspense. The firelight seemed to dim slightly, casting deeper shadows around us. Even the rustling of the leaves seemed to have quieted, as if the forest itself was listening. Standing at the edge of the trees, Noah finally said, his voice barely audible, was a figure. Tall, dark, silhouetted against the fading light. He couldn't make out any details, just shape. Humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, limbs too long. A collective shiver ran through our small group. Even Liam, the staunch pragmatist, shifted uncomfortably. My uncle froze. Noah continued. He said he couldn't move, couldn't speak. He just stared at this figure, and it stared back. Then the figure raised one arm slowly, deliberately, and pointed directly at him. Maya gasped, clutching her chest. Chloe let out a small squeak. Even I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. Noah's quiet, matter-of-fact delivery made the story all the more unsettling. My uncle said he didn't know how long they stood there, just staring at each other. Then the figure slowly lowered its arm, turned, and just melted back in the trees. Vanished. My uncle stood there for a long time, flashlight shaking in his hand, listening to the silence. He never saw it again, never heard the dragging sound again. but he never forgot it either. No finished his story, the fire crackling in the sudden silence. We all sat there for a moment, the weight of his tale hanging heavy in the air. Even Chloe's usual skepticism seemed to have been momentarily silenced.
Wow.
Maya breathed, finally breaking the spell. That's creepy. Really creepy. Liam cleared his throat, trying to inject a dose of rationality back into the atmosphere. Probably just a bear standing on its hind legs, he said, though even he didn't sound entirely convinced. Or a really tall, thin deer, Chloe added weakly, earning a disbelieving snort from Maya. I chuckled nervously, trying to lighten the mood. Okay, no, you win. That was definitely the creepiest one so far. Anyone else got anything to top that? We went around the circle again, each of us telling our own tales of local legends, urban myths, and supposed paranormal encounters. We told stories of haunted houses, ghostly hitchhikers, and strange creatures lurking in the woods. With each story, the fire seemed to burn a little lower, the shadows around us grew a little deeper, and the silence of the forest pressed in a little closer. The air grew colder, a damp chill that seeped into our bones despite the fire. The flames danced and flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and shift with a life of their own. I glanced nervously into the darkness beyond the firelight, feeling a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the unsettling feeling of being watched. Okay, I said, rubbing my hands together. I think that's enough scary stories for one night. How about we roast some marshmallows? There was a general murmur of agreement. Even I was starting to feel a little too spooked for comfort. As we reached for the bag of marshmallows, a new sound cut through the crackling fire and the rustling leaves. A voice. Not one of ours. Deeper, rougher, unfamiliar. It seemed to come from just beyond the circle of firelight, from the impenetrable darkness of the Blackwood Forest. Nice stories. The voice rumbled, sending a shiver of ice down my spine. But you're missing the best one. We froze. Marshmallows forgotten, staring into the darkness, hearts pounding in our chests. The fire crackled, the shadows danced, and the voice echoed in the silence, a chilling presence that had joined our campfire gathering uninvited. The one about you, the voice whispered, and the forest held its breath. A stunned silence descended upon our little campfire circle, thicker and heavier than the forest darkness that surrounded us. We were frozen, caught mid, reach for marshmallows. Our laughter and nervous bravado extinguished as abruptly as if someone had thrown a bucket of water on the flames. Only the crackling fire dared to break the oppressive quiet, a frantic, desperate sound against the backdrop of the unknown voice. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat echoing the sudden terror that gripped me. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my palms. Around the fire, I saw the same raw fear reflected in my friends' faces. Maya's eyes were wide and unblinking, reflecting the firelight like a trapped animal. Liam, usually so quick with a rational explanation, was utterly still, his mouth slightly agape. Chloe's face had gone white, her skepticism apparently vaporized by the sheer, unsettling reality of the voice. Even Noah, who had just delivered a chilling tale himself, looked genuinely disturbed, his usual calm composure fractured by a flicker of primal fear. Who said that? Maya stammered finally, her voice barely a whisper, trembling like a leaf in a storm. She didn't dare turn to look into the darkness, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames, as if they were the only thing anchoring her to reality. No one answered her. We were all too busy listening, straining our ears against the silence that followed the voice, desperately hoping it had been some kind of bizarre auditory hallucination, a trick of the woods, a cruel joke played by the wind. But the silence was absolute, punctuated only by the fire and the frantic thumping of my own heart. Hello. Liam called out, his voice wavering despite his attempt to sound strong. Is anyone there? This isn't funny. His words hung in the air unanswered, swallowed by the oppressive stillness of the forest. Chloe shook her head slowly, her eyes darting nervously around the circle. It's not funny, she echoed, her voice barely audible. It didn't sound like anyone we know. No, ever the observer, slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the darkness beyond the firelight. His eyes, usually calm and introspective, were now sharp and alert, scanning the shadows with an unnerving intensity. It came from over there, he murmured, pointing with a slow, deliberate gesture towards the thickest part of the woods, the area where the trees grew so close together they seemed to blot out the stars. Just beyond the firelight. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to look. I desperately didn't want to look. But the primal urge to know, to understand the source of the voice, was too strong to resist. Slowly, hesitantly, I turned my head in the direction No had indicated. Darkness. Absolute, impenetrable darkness. The firelight cast a flickering circle around us, a fragile island of warmth and illumination in a sea of black. Beyond that circle, nothing. Just the oppressive, suffocating blackness of the Blackwood Forest at night. It felt like staring into a void, a place where unseen things lurked, where whispers turned into screams, and where the rules of the ordinary world ceased to apply. Maybe it was just someone hiking through. Maya suggested weakly, her voice laced with a desperate hope that none of us truly shared. Maybe they just heard us talking and said something. Liam snorted, a harsh, humorless sound. Hiking through Blackwood Forest at night. Who in their right mind would be hiking through Blackwood Forest at night, especially this deep in? His pragmatic mind was already rejecting the flimsy explanations, grappling with the unsettling reality of the situation. And in the voice, Chloe added, her voice trembling. It didn't sound normal. It sounded wrong, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. She was right. The voice hadn't just been deep and rough. It had possessed a strange quality, a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the air around us, a disembodied presence that defied easy explanation. It hadn't sounded like a person speaking, not exactly. It had sounded other. The story, I whispered, my voice barely audible, the words catching in my throat. It said it had a story about us. The chilling words echoed in my mind, replaying themselves with a sickening clarity. About us. The fire crackled again, sending a shower of sparks upwards, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something move in the darkness beyond the firelight. A flicker of shadow, a shift in the blackness, something just at the edge of my vision. But when I blinked, it was gone, leaving only the oppressive darkness and the dancing flames. What does that even mean? Maya whispered, her eyes wide with terror. A story about us. What kind of story? The silence stretched again, heavy and pregnant with unspoken fear. We were trapped in a terrifying limbo, suspended between the familiar comfort of our campfire and the encroaching dread of the unknown voice in the dark. We had been telling ghost stories, seeking a thrill, a manufactured scare. But now, the fear was real, raw, and utterly terrifying. And it was directed at us. Then the voice spoke again, cutting through the silence like a knife, sending another jolt of ice through my veins. You want to hear a story? It rumbled, the sound seeming to emanate from the shadows themselves, wrapping around us, enveloping us in its chilling presence. I have a story for you, a true story. A story you won't forget. This time the voice was closer, definitely closer. It felt like it had moved, shifted position, drawn near to our fragile circle of firelight. The shadows seemed to deepen, to coalesce, to take on a more menacing form. The firelight flickered wildly, as if reacting to the presence of the voice, casting grotesque, dancing shapes that seemed to mimic monstrous figures in the periphery of our vision. Who are you? Liam demanded, his voice stronger this time, laced with a desperate bravado that belied the fear in his eyes. Show yourself. What do you want? The voice chuckled, a low, rasping sound that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't a human chuckle, not a sound of amusement. It was a dry, rattling sound, like bones grinding together, a sound of ancient, malevolent amusement. Show myself, the voice echoed, the rasping chuckle fading into a chilling whisper. Oh, you'll see me soon enough, but first the story. The air grew colder, a biting, unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from the darkness itself. The fire, our only source of warmth and light, seemed to shrink back, its flames flickering weakly against the encroaching cold. The shadows deepened, pressing in on us, and the voice began to speak again, its words weaving themselves into the silence of the forest, a tale spun from darkness and dread. It starts, the voice began, its tone shifting, becoming almost conversational, yet still laced with an undercurrent of menace that made my blood run cold. With 5 friends, just like you. Foolish friends, who thought they could come to Blackwood Forest and play games in the dark. My breath hitched, it knew. It knew about us. It was telling a story about us, about right now, about this very moment around this very campfire. The impossible reality of it slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a hallucination. Something was happening. Something real. Something terrifying. They came to Blackwood. The voice continued, its words painting a chilling picture in my mind, seeking thrills, seeking scares, telling stories around a dying fire, thinking they were safe, thinking they were in control. The voice paused, a pregnant silence that hung heavy in the air. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. My friends were frozen, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. We were trapped, caught in the web of this unseen storyteller, its words weaving a narrative of our own impending doom. They made a mistake, the voice whispered, the words resonating with a chilling finality. A fatal mistake. They thought the stories were just stories. They thought the darkness was just darkness. They thought they were alone. The fire popped, sending a final shower of sparks upwards, a last, desperate burst of light against the encroaching darkness. And then the flames began to dwindle, to shrink back, as if something unseen was drawing the warmth and light away, leaving us exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone in the heart of the Blackwood forest, listening to a voice from the darkness tell a story about us. A story that was just beginning. The fire, our fragile shield against the encroaching darkness, sputtered and shrank, its flames licking weakly at the logs, offering little warmth and even less comfort. The voice from the darkness held us captive, its words weaving a chilling narrative that was terrifyingly focused on us. Each sentence was a tightening knot of dread in my stomach, each pause a breath held in collective terror. We were no longer just telling scary stories, we were in one. The first mistake, the voice continued, its tone taking on a chillingly didactic quality, like a teacher patiently explaining a gruesome lesson, was coming to Blackwood at all. This place, if it listens, it remembers, it feeds. A branch snapped in the darkness, closer this time, much closer. It wasn't the random crack of forest debris settling, it was deliberate, purposeful, like a footstep. We all flinched, our eyes darting wildly towards the sound, but the darkness remained impenetrable, revealing nothing. Blackwood doesn't like visitors. The voice went on, seemingly unfazed by our terror, its narrative unfolding with a relentless, predetermined pace. Especially not foolish children seeking cheap thrills, disturbing the slumbering things. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and tight. Slumbering things. The words conjured images of ancient, malevolent entities, things best left undisturbed, things we had unknowingly awakened with our foolish campfire games. The local whispers about Blackwood Forest suddenly took on a terrifying new weight, no longer just campfire tales, but warnings we had ignored at our peril. The second mistake. The voice rasped, the sound seeming to vibrate through the very ground beneath us, was the stories, ghost stories, around a campfire, in Blackwood. Did you really think you were just entertaining yourselves? Did you think you were just playing? The voice chuckled again, that dry bone, rattling sound that sent another wave of icy dread through me. Stories have power, little ones. Especially here. In places like this, stories become real. They bleed into the fabric of the night. They call things forth. Maya whimpered softly, a small, choked sound of pure fear. I wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, but my own limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if paralyzed by the sheer weight of the voice's words. We were trapped not just physically in the forest, but narratively, caught in the story being woven around us, a story we had unwittingly helped to create. You told stories of ghosts. The voice continued, its tone shifting again, becoming almost accusatory. Of hauntings. Of things that linger after death, and Blackwood listened. Blackwood answered. The fire hissed, spitting a final, pathetic flicker of flame before collapsing in on itself, leaving behind a bed of glowing embers that cast weak, dying shadows. The darkness surged forward, emboldened, pressing in on us, swallowing the last vestiges of light and warmth. We were plunged into near total blackness, the embers casting just enough glow to illuminate the terror in each other's eyes. Glow. The voice murmured, the sound seeming to curl around Chloe's name like a cold, possessive hand. You told of Miller's Mill, of lights in the windows, of the clang of metal. Did you think that was just a story, Chloe? Did you think Old Man Miller was just a figment of your imagination? Chloe gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of breath. I could see her eyes wide and terrified in the dying ember's glow, fixed on the darkness from which the voice emanated. She tried to speak, to deny, to protest, but only a choked whimper escaped her lips. Liam. The voice continued, shifting its focus, its attention now settling on Liam like a predator choosing its next prey. The skeptic, the pragmatist, always seeking a rational explanation for everything, even for things that defy reason, even for things that are hungry. Liam's face was pale, his usual confident smirk replaced by a stark, naked fear. He opened his mouth as if to retort, to argue, to offer a logical counterpoint, but no words came out. The voice had stripped him of his rationality, leaving him exposed to the raw, primal terror that we all now felt. Maya. The voice whispered, the sound almost gentle, yet somehow even more chilling for its unexpected softness. The one who loves to be scared, the one who complains but secretly craves the thrill. You wanted a ghost story, Maya. You wanted to be frightened. Blackwood is happy to oblige. Maya sobbed a small, broken sound in the oppressive darkness. Tears streamed down her face, reflecting the faint ember glow like liquid fear. Her bravado, her playful complaints were gone, replaced by a terror that was consuming her from the inside out. No, the voice murmured, turning its attention to the quiet observer, the one who had shared the unsettling tale of his uncle and the figure in the woods. You understand, don't you know? You sense the things that others miss. You see the shadows that others ignore. You know that some stories are more than just stories. No remained silent, his eyes fixed on the dying embers, his face an unreadable mask. But I could see the subtle tremor in his hands, the slight tightening of his jaw, the unspoken acknowledgement of the truth in the voice's words. He understood. He had always understood. And that understanding was now a source of profound terror. Finally, the voice turned to me, its attention settling upon me with a chilling intensity that made my blood run cold. Ethan. It rumbled, my own name sounding alien and monstrous in its guttural tones. The storyteller, the one who started it all. You wanted to entertain your friends, to weave tales of darkness and dread. But you forgot Ethan. You forgot that some stories are best left untold. The voice paused, a silence so profound it felt like the absence of sound itself, a void in which only terror could exist. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, feel the cold sweat clinging to my skin, feel the crushing weight of the voice's gaze, even though I couldn't see anything in the suffocating darkness. And now, the voice whispered, the words barely audible, yet resonating with a terrifying intimacy. It's time for your story, Ethan. The story you've all been waiting for. The story of tonight. The embers glowed fainter, fading to mere sparks, and then even those were gone, extinguished by the encroaching darkness. We were plunged into absolute blackness, a darkness so complete it felt like being swallowed whole. A darkness filled only with the sound of our own ragged breaths and the chilling whisper of the voice, beginning its final, terrifying tale. It starts. The voice murmured from the void, the words seeming to wrap around us, to become the darkness itself. With a campfire dying embers and 5 foolish friends who made a very bad decision to come to Blackwood Forest. The darkness pressed in, suffocating, consuming. The voice continued to whisper, its story unfolding, a narrative of our fear, our folly, our impending doom. And in the absolute blackness of the Blackwood Forest, as the voice told its story about us, I knew with a chilling certainty that it wasn't just a story anymore. It was real. It was happening. And there was no escape. The story of us, the true scary camping bad decisions horror story, was just beginning, and we were trapped within its terrifying pages, with no way to turn back, no way to write the ending. The voice from the darkness was our narrator now, and its story was our end. They call me Jake. Just Jake. No fancy last name, no dramatic backstory to bore you with right off the bat. I'm a simple guy, or at least, I try to be. Most days you can find me slinging lats at a coffee shop downtown, the kind with exposed brick and overpriced pastries. But when the weekend rolls around, city life can kiss my asphalt, loving behind. I crave green dirt, the smell of pine needles, and the kind of quiet that swallows up the constant hum of traffic. That's why I hike. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Hiking. Real original Jake. But it's not just about the Instagram pics, okay? It's about pushing myself, getting lost in something bigger than myself, feeling that burn in my thighs that reminds me I'm alive and kicking. And sometimes, let's be honest, it's about flirting with a little danger. Not like base, jumping off cliffs danger. More like getting a little lost and maybe seeing a bare danger. The kind that makes the lukewarm coffee and lukewarm conversations back at the cafe taste a whole lot better on Monday morning. This weekend, I was aiming for something a bit more spicy. I'd heard whispers about the Blackwood Forest. Locals called it the Black Heart, or the place the sun forgets. Naturally, that piqued my interest. My buddy Mark tried to talk me out of it. Dude, Blackwood. Seriously, that place is bad news. Old Man Hemlock swore he saw things out there. Things that weren't natural. Mark's a sweetheart, but he believes in Bigfoot and thinks chain emails are legit. So, yeah, I took his warning with a grain of salt the size of a boulder. I did a little digging online, of course. The official park website was all sunshine and rainbows. Reconnect with nature. Breathtaking trails. Stunning views. Typical park propaganda. But then I stumbled upon some forums, buried deep in the internet's underbelly. That's where the real stories were. Hikers talking about getting disoriented, compasses going haywire, days feeling like nights, and whispers. Always whispers. Some dismissed it as folklore, campfire tales spun to spook newbies. Others sounded genuinely shaken. One post, in particular, stuck with me. It was just a few linus. The compass spun wildly, no matter which way I turned. The sun disappeared behind the trees, and the forest started to feel like it was breathing. Chills. I'm not gonna lie, that gave me chills. But not the turn around and go home kind. More like the pack, extra batteries, and maybe a crucifix kind. So, Saturday morning, bright and early, there I was at the trailhead of Blackwood Forest. The air was different here. Thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on you. Even in the morning sun, the trees seemed to lean inwards. Their branches laced together so tightly the sunlight struggled to break through. It wasn't just shady, it was muted. Like someone had turned down the volume on the world. I checked my gear. Backpack, water bottles full, trail mix, map compass, first aid kit, and a brand new, fully charged GPS over Kibby. But better safe than sorry, right? Especially in a place like this. I took a deep breath, the air tasting damp and earthy, and stepped onto the trail. The first hour was, well, boring. Just trees. Lots and lots of trees, towering pines, gnarled oaks, and these weird, pale trees with papery bark that looked almost skeletal. The trail was well marked, though, and my compass was behaving itself. See, Mark. See, Old Man Hemlock. Nothing to be scared of. Just another walk in the woods. Famous last words, right? It started subtly. A feeling more than anything, like I was being watched. You know, the prickle on the back of your neck. Yeah, that. I glanced around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Just shadows and leaves rustling in a breeze I couldn't feel. Probably just my imagination, running wild with all those creepy forum posts. I picked up my pace, whistling a tuneless melody to try and shake off the unease. Then the compass started acting up. At first, it was just a slight tremor, the needle wavering for a second before settling back on north. Annoying but nothing to write home about, but it got worse. Fast. It started spinning, jittering like it was having a seizure. North, south, east, west, I couldn't decide. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at the frantic needle. Okay, that's weird. Maybe it was just a faulty compass. I pulled out my GPS. Full signal. Thank God for technology, right? I punched in my coordinates, expecting it to pinpoint my location instantly. Nothing. The screen stayed blank, the little arrow stubbornly refusing to move. Searching for signal, it blinked mockingly. Searching for signal in the middle of a forest with full bars. That's not how GPS works. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of my calm. Okay, deep breaths, Jake. Don't freak out. Compasses can be unreliable in certain areas, magnetic anomalies and all that jazz. And GPS, well, technology glitches, right? It happens. I decided to rely on the trail markers. They were still there, painted blue blazes on the trees, guiding me somewhere. I just had to keep following them. And eventually I'd pop out on the other side of the forest, blinking in the sunlight, laughing at how worked up I'd gotten over nothing. But the sun was starting to fade. I glanced up through the dense canopy. It was still daytime, wasn't it? It couldn't be that late. I'd only been hiking for a few hours, but the light was definitely dimming, the shadows lengthening and deepening, swallowing up the trail ahead. It felt like dusk or even later, but that was impossible, wasn't it? And then I heard it, a sound so faint, so subtle. I almost dismissed it as the wind, but there was no wind. The leaves were still, the air heavy and still. It was a low, rhythmic sound, a soft sighing, like a slow, deep breath being drawn in and released. I stopped again, heart hammering against my ribs, straining my ears. There it was again. Closer now, louder. Huo-halav, the forest. It really did feel like it was breathing. The breathing sound was undeniable now, resonating through the trees, vibrating in my chest. It wasn't the wind, or animals, or anything natural I could name. It was the forest itself, inhaling and exhaling, a living, sentient entity surrounding me. My rational brain screamed nonsense. But the primal part of me, the part that still remembered shadows and whispers in the dark, was screaming something else entirely. Run. But run where? My compass was useless, my GPS a brick, and the sun was a forgotten memory, swallowed by the oppressive canopy. The trail markers, those reassuring blue blazes, suddenly seemed less like guides and more like breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs leading deeper into the woods, into the lungs of this breathing forest. I tried to backtrack, racing my steps, hoping to find my way back to the trailhead, but it was like the forest was shifting around me. Trees that I swore I'd passed just moments ago looked different, their shapes twisted and unfamiliar. The trail, once clear and defined, seemed to blur and fade, disappearing into the undergrowth like smoke. Every direction looked the same, endless rows of trees, shrouded in deepening twilight, all whispering with that unsettling breath. Huo-halav, closer now, much closer. It felt like the breath was right behind me, a warm, damp exhalation on my neck. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat, expecting to see what? A giant tree, like creature with lungs of leaves and bark. Ridiculous. But the fear was real, a cold fist clenching in my gut. There was nothing there. Just trees, shadows, and silence except for the breathing. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, intensified. It wasn't just a prickle on my neck anymore. It was a full-body alarm, every nerve-ending screaming danger. I started to run. Not a controlled, strategic run, but a panicked, desperate flight. Branches whipped at my face. Thorns tore at my clothes. Roots snagged at my boots, but I didn't care. I just had to get away. Away from the breathing, away from the shadows, away from the feeling that something was closing in. The forest seemed to respond to my panic, the trees closing ranks, the undergrowth thickening, as if trying to trap me. The blue trail markers vanished completely, mocking promises in a world that had turned hostile. I stumbled blindly, crashing through bushes, scrambling over fallen logs, directionless, lost, and utterly alone. Then I saw it, a flicker of something pale in the gloom ahead. Hope, fragile but fierce, flared in my chest. Civilization, another hiker. Anything was better than this suffocating green hell. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my lungs, the stitch in my side, the growing despair that threatened to overwhelm me. As I got closer, the pale flicker resolved itself into a shape. A structure. Too angular, too deliberate to be natural. It was a cabin. Small, dilapidated, almost swallowed by the encroaching trees, but undeniably a cabin. Smoke curled faintly from a crooked chimney, a thin, pale thread against the deepening gloom. Salvation it had to be. Someone lived here, someone who knew this forest, someone who could help me. I stumbled towards it, legs heavy as lead. Relief washing over me in a dizzying wave. I could almost taste hot coffee, feel the warmth of a fire, hear a human voice that wasn't my own ragged breathing. As I approached, I noticed details I'd missed in my frantic rush. The cabin was in worse shape than I'd first thought. The wood was gray and weathered, the roof sagged, and the windows were dark, like empty eye sockets staring out from a skull. An unsettling silence hung around it, a silence deeper than the forest's usual muted quiet. But the smoke was real. Someone was inside. I had to believe that. I picked up my pace, ignoring the ominous feeling that was starting to creep back in, whispering warnings in the back of my mind. I reached the porch, the wood groaning under my weight. The front door was ajar, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. I hesitated, hand hovering over the warped wood, a sudden wave of unease washing over me. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. But what choice did I have? Go back into the breathing forest? No. Anything was better than that. Hello. I called out, my voice hoarse and shaky. Is anyone there? I'm lost. Can you help me? Silence. Only the faint crackle of fire from inside and the ever-present hue-of the forest. Hello. I called again, louder this time, pushing the door open wider. It creaked inwards with a long, mournful groan, revealing a single dimly lit room. The air inside was thick and heavy, smelling of wood smoke and something acrid, metallic, faintly rotten. The room was small and sparsely furnished. A rough-hewn table stood in the center, littered with strange objects, dried herbs, animal bones, tarnished metal tools I couldn't identify. A fireplace dominated one wall, embers glowing faintly within. And in the corner, a figure sat hunched in a rocking chair back to me, shrouded in shadow. "Excuse me," I said, stepping hesitantly into the cabin. "I'm lost. My compass and GPS are busted. Could you point me in the direction of the trail?" The figure didn't move, didn't speak. Just sat there, rocking slowly, rhythmically, the chair creaking in time with the forest breathing. Halawa creak creak. Hello. I tried again, a little louder, a little more insistent. Can you hear me? I need help. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the figure began to turn. The rocking chair creaked louder, the shadows shifted, and the figure turned as slowly, agonizingly slowly. The figure began to turn. The rocking chair creaked louder, the shadows shifted, and the figure turned and turned and turned. If it was like watching a broken doll, joints grinding, head lolling at an unnatural angle. The shadows clung to it, obscuring details, but I could make out something pale and gaunt, draped in dark, ragged cloth. And then, finally, the face came into view. Or what was left of it. It wasn't human, not anymore. The skin was stretched taut over bone. Like parchment, a sickly yellow-gray color. Eye sockets were deep and hollow, but in their depths, 2 points of light burned, small and red and intensely bright, like embers glowing in a skull. The nose was gone, just 2 slits in the withered flesh. And the mouth was a gaping maw, stretched impossibly wide, filled with rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth. Too many teeth, too sharp, too unnatural. It wasn't looking at me, not exactly. Those red eyes seemed to pierce through me, to see something beyond me, something in the very air around me. But it was aware of me. I could feel it, a cold, predatory awareness that made my blood run like ice water. The breathing stopped. The forest held its breath with me, every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches, suspended in a terrifying stillness. Only the rocking chair continued to creak, a slow, rhythmic pulse in the silence. Creak, creak, creak. Then the mouth moved. The impossibly wide maw stretched even wider, and a sound emerged. Not a voice, not words, but a wet, rattling sound, like bones clicking together, like air hissing through rotten flesh. It was a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight into my marrow, a sound that spoke of ancient hunger and bottomless dread. The figure raised a hand. Long, skeletal fingers, tipped with black, sharpened nails, like claws. It gestured towards me, a slow, beckoning gesture, and the red eyes seemed to fix on me, burning into my soul. Run. That primal scream in my brain was deafening now, drowning out all reason, all thought. Run, Jake, run like hell. And this time I didn't hesitate. I turned and bolted, crashing back out of the cabin, stumbling blindly back into the forest. The breathing started again, louder now, faster, chasing me through the trees. Huahala, hate uaf. IHA, it was the forest bred, yes, but it was also something else. Something the figure in the cabin controlled. Something it was using to hunt me. The trees whipped past in a blur, shadows dancing around me, mocking me. I could hear noises now, besides the breathing. Whispers. Faint, sibilant whispers, just at the edge of hearing, weaving through the rustling leaves, carried on the forest's breath. They weren't words, not exactly, but they were suggestive. Promises of pain, of darkness, of things I didn't want to understand. I ran until my lungs burned, my legs screamed, my vision swam with black spots. But I couldn't stop. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that if I stopped, it would catch me. The figure, the breathing forest, whatever it was, it would drag me back into that cabin, into that darkness, and I would become something like it. Something broken and twisted and hungry. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, minutes. Time had lost all meaning in the breathing forest. The darkness deepened, swallowing the last vestiges of daylight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, weaving themselves into my thoughts, trying to pull me under. Then, through the trees, I saw another light, fainter than the cabin's fire, smaller, but different. A steady, unwavering light, not flickering embers, but something artificial. Hope, fragile but stubborn, flickered again. Another cabin. No, too bright, too steady. It was a road. Headlights. Civilization. With a final surge of adrenaline, fueled by desperation and a sliver of hope. I stumbled towards the light, pushing through the last line of trees, collapsing onto the hard asphalt of a road. A car was approaching, headlights cutting through the darkness. I waved my arms frantically, yelling, my voice cracking and hoarse. The car slowed, then stopped. A window rolled down, and a face peered out at me, a young woman, eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay? What happened?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. I tried to speak, to explain about the forest, the breathing, the cabin, the figure, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was too tight, my mind too fractured, my body too exhausted. I just shook my head, tears streaming down my face, and pointed back into the trees. She looked in the direction I was pointing, her brow furrowed, then back at me, her expression shifting from concern to something else, as something colder. Something like recognition. "Blackwood Forest, huh?" she said, her voice suddenly flat, devoid of emotion. "Made a wrong turn, did you?" I just nodded, unable to speak, still shaking, still hearing the whispers in my head, the breathing in my ears. She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes unnervingly blank. Then a slow, chilling smile spread across her face. A smile that mirrored the gaping maw of the figure in the cabin. A smile that showed too many teeth, too sharp, too unnatural. "Don't worry," she said, her voice now a wet, rattling hiss, like bones clicking together, like air hissing through rotten flesh. "We all make bad decisions sometimes. Come on, get in. We'll take you home." And as I stared into those red, burning eyes, I knew there was no escape. The forest had breathed me in, and now it was breathing me out, into something far, far worse. My name is Jake, just Jake. No fancy last name, no middle initial, just plain old Jake. I'm about as average as they come, I guess. Mid-20s, work a desk job pushing papers around for some insurance company, live in a cookie-cutter apartment in the suburbs, the whole 9 yards. Weekends are usually spent catching up on chores, maybe grabbing a beer with friends, the usual humdrum. But every now and then the monotony gets to me. That's when the itch starts, the wilderness itch. It's not like I'm some seasoned outdoorsman or anything. My idea of roughing it is usually forgetting to charge my phone. But there's something about getting out into the woods, away from the concrete and the constant buzz of notifications, that just resets me. My grandpa, bless his soul, was a park ranger up in the Rockies. He used to tell me stories about the mountains, about the quiet, the animals, the way the air smelled different up there. He passed away a few years back, but those stories, they stuck with me. Hiking, for me, it's kind of like keeping a piece of him alive. So, when Friday rolled around and the fluorescent lights of the office started feeling extra suffocating, I knew I needed a fix. I checked the weather, surprisingly clear for late fall, crisp but sunny. Perfect hiking weather. I decided on the Blackwood Forest Trail. It's not too far from the city, maybe an hour's drive, and it's got a decent loop that usually takes a few hours to hike. Nothing too strenuous, just enough to clear my head and feel like I'd actually done something with my weekend besides watch TV. Saturday morning, I packed my usual hiking gear, backpack packed with water, bladder, some trail mix, a granola bar or two, a small first, aid kit, mostly Band-Aids, let's be honest, and my trusty flashlight. It's one of those tactical ones, ridiculously bright, probably overkill for a day hike. But hey, better safe than sorry, right? Threw on my hiking boots, a flannel shirt, grabbed my car keys, and headed out. The drive was uneventful, mostly highway and then winding back roads as I got closer to the forest. The air started to change, getting cooler, smelling of pine and damp earth. I pulled into the trailhead parking lot, which was surprisingly empty. Good, I thought. Peace and quiet. Just what I needed. The Blackwood Forest Trail's off pretty tame, wide and well maintained, mostly flat. Sunlight dappled through the leaves, painting shifting patterns on the path. Birds chirped, squirrels rustled in the undergrowth, the usual forest sounds. It was calming, exactly what I was hoping for. I started at a leisurely pace, enjoying the scenery, letting my thoughts drift. After about an hour, the trail started to climb, getting steeper and rockier. The trees grew denser, blocking out more of the sunlight. The forest felt different here, older, quieter, almost watchful. The cheerful chirping of birds faded, replaced by a deeper, rustling silence. I checked my watch, still early afternoon, plenty of daylight left. I pushed on, wanting to reach the lookout point marked on the trail map. It promised panoramic views of the valley, and I was looking forward to that. The climb got tougher, my breath coming a little harder. I stopped for a water break, leaning against a moss-covered boulder. The silence was almost oppressive now, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere deeper in the woods. It was a different kind of quiet than the peaceful quiet of the lower trail. This was a silence that felt alive, like something was listening. I shook it off. Just my imagination running wild, I told myself. Too many horror movies lately. I finished my water, tightened my backpack straps, and started hiking again. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper and deeper into the woods. I lost track of time, my focus narrowing to the path ahead, the rhythm of my boots on the dirt, the steady climb. Then nature called. I stepped off the trail deeper into the trees, wanting a little privacy. Found a decent spot behind a thick clump of bushes, unzipped my fly, and got down to business. It was quiet still, the air cool against my skin. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant murmur of the wind in the higher branches. Just me in the woods. Finished, I zipped up, turned to head back to the trail, and that's when I saw them. My flashlight beam, which I'd instinctively switched on as the shadows deepened around me, caught something in the undergrowth. A pair of eyes, reflecting back at me, glowing in the darkness between the trees. They were big, too big for a deer. I'd seen deer eyes before, small, gentle, almost timid. These were different, wider, rounder, and intense. And they were high, way too high for a wolf. Wolves might be tall, but these were easily 6, maybe 7 feet off the ground, perched somewhere above the bushes watching me. My blood ran cold. My heart hammered against my ribs. I froze. Flashlight beam locked on those eyes, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Deer. No. Wolf. Impossible. Bear, maybe. But bay bears usually have smaller eyes closer together, don't they? And they wouldn't be that high up. Whatever it was big. And it was watching me. In the deep, silent woods, miles from anywhere. And I was alone, my breath hitched in my throat. A silent gasp lost in the stillness of the woods. Those eyes, they just stared back, unblinking, reflecting the harsh white beam of my flashlight like polished obsidian. They weren't animal eyes. Not in the way I understood animals. There was an intelligence there, something cold and calculating, that sent a shiver crawling down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, flashlight beam against whatever it was. My mind struggled to catch up, to categorize, to rationalize. But there was nothing in my experience, nothing in my understanding of the natural world that fit those eyes. Too big, too high, too wrong. Then a low sound rumbled through the woods, a deep guttural growl that vibrated in my chest. It wasn't the snarl of a dog or the roar of a bear. It was lower, more resonant, like the earth itself was groaning. The sound seemed to emanate from the darkness behind those eyes. And the eyes themselves, they shifted. Not physically moving, but changing. The intense reflection seemed to intensify, burning brighter, almost glowing with an inner light. Panic flared in my chest, hot and sharp. My rational hiker brain screamed to me to identify the threat, to assess the danger, to plan an escape. But my primal brain, the ancient lizard part of me, was already overriding logic. It was screaming one word, run, and I listened. I didn't even think about being quiet, about stealth. I just spun around, scrambling back towards the trail, my boots slipping on the loose leaves and pine needles. The flashlight beam bounced wildly, throwing grotesque shadows against the trees, turning familiar shapes into monstrous figures. Behind me, I could hear the rustling of undergrowth, a heavy, deliberate crashing sound that was definitely not a deer bounding away. Whatever was watching me was moving, and it was coming closer. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I plunged through the trees, branches whipping at my face, thorns snagging at my clothes. I lost all sense of direction, my only focus on putting distance between myself and those eyes, that girl, that thing in the woods. I stumbled, tripped over a root hidden beneath the leaves, and went sprawling. The flashlight flew from my hand, skittering across the forest floor and plunging me into near darkness. Just the faintest ambient light filtered through the dense canopy above, barely enough to see my hand in front of my face. Terror seized me, cold and paralyzing. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The crashing sounds behind me were closer now, much closer. I could hear heavy footfalls, the snapping of branches, the rustling of leaves directly behind me. It was gaining on me. With a surge of adrenaline, I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in my knee where I'd landed. I fumbled blindly for my flashlight, my fingers brushing against cold metal, leaves, damp earth. Finally, I grasped it, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it again. I clicked it on. The beam stabbed through the darkness, cutting a narrow swath of light through the trees. But the eyes were gone. Just gone. The undergrowth where I'd seen them was empty, still, silent. Only the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the whisper of the wind in the branches. The heavy crashing sounds had stopped too. Silence. A silence that was somehow even more terrifying than the growl had been. Had I imagined it? Had it all been some trick of the light, some hallucination brought on by fatigue and too much solitude? Maybe it was just a deer after all, its eyes reflecting strangely, the growl just my own panicked breathing amplified in my ears. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sheer wrongness of those eyes, the intensity of that growl, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, it was too real, too visceral to be just my imagination. I stood there, frozen, flashlight beam sweeping nervously through the trees, searching for any sign, any sound. Nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the Blackwood forest. Slowly, cautiously, I started to move again. Not running this time, but walking quickly, deliberately, back in the direction I thought the trail should be. I kept the flashlight beam trained ahead, sweeping from side to side, my senses on high alert, straining to hear, to see, to smell anything out of the ordinary. The woods remained silent, indifferent. The trees loomed around me tall and dark, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out. The shadows seemed to deepen, to coalesce into shapes, to watch me from the edges of the light. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through me. I walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Time seemed to warp and distort in the oppressive silence of the woods. I started to doubt myself, to wonder if I was even going in the right direction. The trail, which had been so clear before, seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the deepening gloom. Panic started to gnaw at the edges of my resolve. I was lost, alone, in the dark, and something was out there. Something with eyes too big, too high, too wrong. Then, through the trees, I saw it, a faint glimmer of light, not the harsh white of my flashlight, but a softer, warmer glow. Hope surged through me, a desperate, fragile thing. Civilization, the parking lot, the trail. I stumbled towards it, pushing through the undergrowth, ignoring the scratches and scrapes. The light grew stronger, resolving into a flickering orange glow, and then I saw it, a fire, burning in a small clearing just off the trail, a campfire crackling merrily, casting dancing shadows against the surrounding trees, and beside the fire a figure, sitting on a log, silhouetted against the flames. Relief washed over me, so intense it almost made me weak. Human contact. Safety. I wasn't alone after all. Someone else was out here. Someone who could help me get back to the trail, back to my car, back to safety. Hello. I called out, my voice hoarse, cracking with relief and lingering fear. Hello, is anyone there? The figure by the fire didn't move, didn't turn, just sat there, still as a statue, silhouetted against the flickering flames. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through the trees, and the figure remained motionless. Hello. I called again, louder this time, my voice echoing through the silent woods. Can you help me? I'm lost. Still no response. The figure remained stubbornly still, unmoving, unhearing. It was starting to feel wrong, unnatural, like a mannequin posed beside a campfire, not a living person. Cautiously, I approached the clearing, my flashlight beam fixed on the figure by the fire. As I got closer, I could make out more details. It was a person, or at least it looked like a person, slumped forward, head bowed, long dark hair hanging down, obscuring their face. They were wearing dark clothes, heavy boots, And was that fur around their shoulders? My relief started to curdle, replaced by a prickle of unease. Something was wrong, very wrong. This wasn't the friendly hiker I'd hoped for. This felt different, ominous. I stopped a few feet from the edge of the clearing, my flashlight beam still trained on the figure. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper now, fear creeping back into my throat. "Are you okay? I'm lost, can you help me?" Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the figure began to move. It straightened up, lifting its head. The long dark hair shifted, revealing a face. But not a human face. The face that emerged from beneath the dark hair was not human. Not even close. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, 2 eyes, a nose like protrusion, a mouth. But the proportions were all wrong, distorted, grotesque. The skin was a sickly pale gray, stretched taut over sharp angles and jutting bones. The eyes, they were the same eyes I'd seen in the woods, wide, round, obsidian black, but now, closer, I could see details I'd missed before. They were wet, glistening, almost insectile, and in the flickering firelight, I could swear I saw tiny pinpricks of red within the blackness, like embers glowing deep inside. There was no discernible nose, just 2 slits high on the face like nostrils, but too far apart, too vertical. And the mouth, it was a thin, lipless gash that stretched almost from ear to ear, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. Too many teeth, too small, too sharp, like a shark's mouth crammed onto a human face. But the worst part, the truly horrifying part, was the expression. Or rather, the lack of it. There was no emotion in that face, no recognition, no hostility, no anything. Just a blank, empty stare. Those black eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intensity that felt like they were seeing right through me, peeling back my skin, examining my soul. I stood frozen, my mind completely blank. All thought, all reason, all coherent response simply shut down. My body was a statue of fear, every muscle locked tight, my breath trapped in my chest. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand, casting wild, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist around the figure, making its features shift and distort even further. And then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it raised a hand. Not a hand like mine, flesh and blood and bone. This was different. Long, spindly fingers, each tipped with a wickedly sharp black claw. The skin was the same pale gray as the face, stretched thin, almost translucent, revealing the dark shapes of tendons and bone beneath. It moved with a jerky, unnatural fluidity, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. The hand reached out towards me, those black claws extended, and a sound came from the lipless mouth. Not a growl this time, but a whisper. A dry, rustling sound like leaves skittering across dry pavement, but deeper, somehow resonating in my bones. I couldn't understand the words, if they were words at all. It was more like a sibilant hiss, a series of clicks and scrapes, a language not meant for human ears. But somehow, instinctively I understood. It wasn't an invitation or a greeting. It was a claim. A possessive, predatory sound that resonated with the same cold intelligence I'd seen in those eyes. That was enough to break the paralysis. The primal scream of run echoed in my brain again, louder, more insistent than before. This time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I just reacted. I dropped the flashlight. Didn't even register it falling to the ground, the beam extinguished, plunging the clearing into near darkness. I just turned and ran blindly, desperately. Back the way I'd come, back into the woods, back in the suffocating darkness. This time, I didn't hear crashing sounds behind me. No heavy footfalls, no snapping branches. Just silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not the watchful silence of the deep woods, but a hunting silence. A silence that felt expectant. Like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed, until my vision blurred and my head swam. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. Just away, away from the fire, away from the face, away from those eyes. I stumbled again, fell this time harder, sprawling onto the forest floor, the air knocked out of my lungs. I lay there for a moment, gasping, sobbing. Unable to move, convinced that any second those claws would descend, that face would loom over me, that whispering voice would claim me for the darkness. But nothing happened. Silence. Stillness. Just the faint rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind. No pursuing footsteps, no guttural growls, no rustling whispers. Just nothing. Slowly, agonizingly, I pushed myself up, my body trembling. every muscle screaming in protest. I looked back into the darkness behind me, expecting to see those eyes, that face, emerging from the trees. But there was nothing, just the impenetrable blackness of the woods. Had it stopped chasing me? Had it given up, or was it just toying with me? Letting me run, letting me tire myself out before what? I didn't want to think about it. I started walking again, slower now, more cautiously, but still moving, still pushing myself forward. I had to get out of these woods. I had to get back to civilization, back to light, back to safety. And then I heard it, faintly, distantly, but unmistakably. The sound of traffic. Cars hissing on asphalt, the low rumble of engines, the distant whine of tires. Civilization, it was close. Closer than I dared to hope. Hope surged through me again, a fragile spark in the overwhelming darkness. I stumbled towards the sound, pushing through the trees, ignoring the pain, the fear, the exhaustion. The sound grew louder, clearer, more insistent. And then through the trees, I saw it. Not a fire this time, but lights, streetlights. Faint yellow glows in the distance, but lights nonetheless. The edge of the forest. The road escape. I broke into a run again. Fueled by adrenaline and desperation, pushing through the last of the trees, bursting out of the woods and onto the shoulder of a paved road. Streetlights lined the asphalt, casting pools of pale yellow light. Cars whizzed past, their headlights cutting through the darkness. The sounds of civilization, of human activity, washed over me a wave of overwhelming relief. I was out, I was safe. I was alive. I stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, leaning against a road sign, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stand. I looked back at the dark line of trees, the impenetrable blackness of the Blackwood forest, expecting to see those eyes, that face, watching me from the edge of the woods. But there was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the shadows shifting in the streetlight, the indifferent silence of the forest. It was just woods. Normal woods. Nothing monstrous, nothing unnatural. Just trees and shadows and silence. Had I imagined it all? Had it been a hallucination, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion and fear? Had there really been eyes in the woods? A figure by the fire? A face like that? I didn't know, and all I knew was that I was out, I was safe. And I was never, ever going back into the Blackwood forest. I turned away from the woods, towards the lights of the road, and started walking, my legs stiff and aching, my body trembling, but moving. Away from the darkness towards the light, away from the silence, towards the sounds of humanity, away from the Blackwood forest and whatever lurked within its depths. I never looked back, and I never will. Because sometimes the things you see in the woods, they're not just your imagination. And sometimes bad decisions can follow you home.